some manner of speaking that religion and politics can't be totally separated.
Oh yes, and so I completely understand that, and yet it bothers me when I see, and this is probably part of my because of my evangelical Christian background. There was a time not that long ago where lots of people in the evangelical world were very much opposed to the merging of church and state. I mean, that would be a big thing that a lot of evangelical Christians would point out in history, really not knowing the history of the ancient world, but they would point to Constantine and say, "See, he merged church and state, and that's when the church went to hell."
The
Uh, and
fucking
now, and now they so easily embrace it, and um, and I think in some ways they had. That's a good point. When those two things become wedded so much, um, again, when people think God is on their side, um, it gives them permission to do or behave in good ways, but also very bad ways, and that's something that I deal with, and I haven't quite dealt with it mentally and emotionally. Just I haven't figured out how to work this out in my own life. How to address that issue when I see it.
hello?
Hello.
Okay, I didn't know people would respond to me. I'm sorry, it was just weird. I didn't know when to come to call someone was talking and you're talking about this different issue. What led him into that that kind of like point? What led him into that? Can someone tell me?
We were largely talking about. Um, you're having a little bit of a sound issue on your end. Could you mute when you're not talking?
Oh, okay.
It just sometimes there's interference between different people who are talking, so I appreciate that. We were largely talking about kind of initially we were talking about just the sheer variety that exists within his Christian traditions. Uh, I was sort of speaking it from the perspective of a non-Christian, which I can get into at some point later. But we eventually got into where a lot of the outliers are within Christian denominations and how those lines are drawn, largely through political ones. And we were especially sort of looking at how, especially in America, but in the West in general, a lot of your far extremes, either left or right, from a political perspective, from a political spectrum, largely come from the most modern forms of Protestant Christianity. And that's where we led into kind of how the church separation of church and state relates to religion, particularly of the Christian variety.
All right. Can I bring up one thing about religious outliers that actually I was reminded of earlier?
Sure, absolutely.
Ben Carson is a Seventh-day Adventist, and after he made that whole statement about how Muslims can't be loyal to the U.S. government properly, someone published an article and pointed out the fact that he's a Seventh-day Adventist, and people said the exact same thing about his religion prior. It used to be that Seventh-day Adventists were kind of excluded from mainstream Christian circles because they were weird. If you don't know well, from what I understand, I'm not sure well, I have a friend who said he thinks they're very heretical, but what I understand, the main things that make them weird are the fact that their religion was founded, their religion is centered, they have dietary regulations. They're Christians, but they have dietary regulations. They practice the Sabbath, their sort of services on Saturday as opposed to Sunday. Christians usually do Christians do Sunday because it's associated with resurrection, and they have certain dietary regulations, and they're just sort of very centered on health. A lot of Seventh-day Adventists are doctors. Okay.
There again, I think that largely reinforces the point that I was making before, because a lot of these largely American offshoot forms of Protestantism are very, very modern. You have Seventh-day Adventists, you have the Jehovah's Witnesses, you have Mormons, you have dominionist fundamentalists, charismatic Christians of variety of different types of people who call themselves non-denominational, and they can be seemingly very extreme and and seemingly very anti-authority, while still being at the bare bones of it being very authoritarian.
You're saying Mormonism is a modern religion? Do you mean modern in the past 300 years, or do you mean modern as in like maybe in the last 20 or 30 years?
Modern within the perspective of the last few hundred years.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, one thing I should point out the fact is I think anti-Mormons. I think it's okay. Well, they're anti. Comes from this. The idea comes from anti-Mormons, but I do believe it is the case that Mormons, like many of the things their scriptures address, are based. Well, they were based off they were addressing the religious issues of the day. I think one of that was actually, does baptism get rid of all your previous sins? And they actually, there's like a chapter in the Book of Mormon, or there's just a part of it addressing that issue. Oh, and also another thing is the point I think is Nephi. The character of Nephi in the Book of Mormon is people want to make him a king, and he says, no, I want a republic, which is exactly what Washington did. I'm done speaking. Someone else can jump in if they want.
Did you have any thoughts, Chuck?
I'm actually still listening, and I'm trying to process what he was saying.
The other thing I pointed out earlier, I'm not sure if you heard me, but I did say I fucking hate the people who say that Constantine ruined Christianity. I can't stand them. I'm saying they really annoy me. As someone who is interested, reads a lot about church history, about Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, I can't stand how they hate Constantine.
That I will address. Yeah, I do too. But when I was a evangelical Bible Christian, I didn't know anything about church history except what I heard from pastors who themselves didn't know anything about church history. So it wasn't until later on when I started reading about church history and realizing, oh, well, what they said really didn't happen. There wasn't this all sudden drastic change from what Constantine did to what the early church was like. I mean, there wasn't this super radical transformation. And so, yes, today the argument is just, it's completely ridiculous. But lots of people, at least one time, did believe it in the evangelical world, and so the reason I brought that up was now they seem to be okay with kind of a merging of church and state, where at one time they would point to Constantine as the death of the church until Martin Luther came along, and now they're like, yeah, we can have a merging of church and state now. So I just find that development over the last, at least in my experience, over the last 15 or so years, really interesting. That certain branches of the evangelical Christian world have evolved so quickly in that regard.
One thing I want to point out, okay, I just want to say two things about that. First of all, the modern anti-Constantine people, many of them seem like very hippie Christians, which I like that, because like what you said earlier, yeah, I like the also like lots of modern Protestants tend to sort of, it ties them back. Like you used to have Christians from different political denominations, or different, you have certain denominations that were very heavily left-leaning or something like that, or it's tied to that. So there's that, and then second of all, okay, how well read are you about church history? And I feel like if you are actually well-read, I'd like to ask you, do you know any major changes in the church that occurred after the time of Constantine?
Well, yes, I'm actually pretty well read in church history. I mean, there certainly were changes after Constantine, but I mean, when the church became, well, Constantine legalized Christianity. He didn't make it the official religion. It was his grandson Theodosius is the one that
He outlawed paganism in response to too much religious violence on both sides.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the big changes was there were Christians who later became known as the Desert Fathers that didn't like that the empire and the church were getting so cozy. So there was this kind of movement off into the desert by some Christians, as kind of a protest to that. So that was one big thing. And then, of course, just the power structure. Once Christianity becomes, once the church becomes favored in the empire, well, I mean, it gets all these political benefits that other religions once had and then don't have anymore. Obviously, the nature of worship begins to change in some way. I mean, the councils, you have all the ecumenical councils that are called after Constantine, and I can't imagine that that made it so much easier for the church to kind of declare, well, this is what we teach, this is what the church teaches. And I think that there's less and less acceptance of theological variety as the generations after Constantine progress.
All right, I see what you mean. I know that, for example, the Christian canon was the modern day the Christian canon, at least when it comes to New Testament, is never debated. However, in the early church, there were debates about what books, but almost all the books. Okay, the thing I want to point out is the fact that it took a while for the Book of Revelation to actually get into Christian canon, and certain church fathers were really pissed off at it and hated it because they thought, this is very, there's a scene where Jesus is on a horse and he comes to kill everyone who's evil. That was kind of, people didn't like that, among other, and it's very kind of, it's sort of weird. It seems like the world is destroyed 3 times and then the apocalypse happens. John worships an angel in the book. Okay, there are different reasons. Like, all right, just from my reading, I don't know the reasons they listed for not reading it. The thing about Constantine, you're saying that you think the Desert Fathers, like the monastic movement, started as a protest against Christianity getting involved with the state? Did St. Anthony say something about that?
Well, yeah, St. Anthony did. I don't know if it was like this. It wasn't so much an organized, like, okay, this is a movement, as we would have in the modern world. Let's have this big movement. But I get the sense from some of the church fathers, St. Anthony in particular, that this was a concern of his. Not so much that it was a union of church and state, because they didn't really have that sort of a distinction in that period in history. I mean, it wasn't like there's such a thing as a secular government. I mean, it was the empire. The Rome was Rome. But I think St. Anthony is writing about his concern with the church gaining too much. Getting too close with the emperor, that sort of a thing. And a lot of the Desert Fathers kind of hem-haw, write about it in some vague ways that, particularly as the ecumenical councils begin to happen and where emperors begin to throw in their 2 cents about theology. And there are certainly arguments from the Desert Fathers and some of the theologians, well, this is an emperor, he's not a theologian, he shouldn't be interfering in this. That was certainly the argument with in the 5th century when the Coptic Church broke off, was that they were arguing that there's too much influence from the emperor in Byzantium. I mean, there's this whole rivalry that sets up between Alexandria and Byzantium, and Pope Leo comes in, and there's this big cluster between these various different groups, and Alexandria was certainly arguing that they felt that the emperor was being too influenced. Too influential in the theology.
Okay. What was I going to say about that? Okay, I think I don't think I have anything to say about that. I'm just wondering. All right, now we can get talk to politics.
I mean, just real quick on just to continue that last conversation, that sense that the Roman authorities had too much say in the theological aspects of the church, it becomes more and more apparent once you get into the 6th and the 7th centuries, where there's the big iconoclastic controversy where one of the emperors, and I can't remember who it is, but let's burn all the icons and let's destroy them.
There's a giant controversy about images of God and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. And that's probably the most explicit example where there are Christians writing that Rome, the emperor, has too much control because he's created this ecumenical council that goes his way, and then he dies, and then I don't remember if it was an heir or a sister. There's this whole kind of it's called we have the term Byzantine politics for I suppose for a reason, because it becomes this just massive debate that goes on for I don't know, might be 100 years, at least a couple generations, where all the images are destroyed, or they try to destroy the images, and then later on an emperor comes in and says, "Oh no, we're going to have images again because now we have this council, and this is the real council. This is the decision God really wants." And I think that seems to be the period in church history where that, at least in the East, where that kind of sentiment that Rome may have too much power here, because there's a lot of stories, and probably most of them are legends, but there's a lot of stories that circulate in the church fathers of that period about such and such a saint is called to meet with the emperor, but they refuse, and the emperor has to go and visit them because this particular saint is so revered that even the evil emperor at the time has to go and listen to the holy saint, the holy man in the desert. And so there's definitely a lot of kind of political stuff that's going on there, and but it's very different than today as well. I mean, that kind of brings us full circle, because whatever was happening in the 7th century is completely different than what happens today, because people in the 7th century in the Eastern Mediterranean just didn't think the way we think today. And that was a kind of a conversation we had earlier, was that one of the things that blew my mind was just how different the world was then than it is now. It's really hard.
Sure,
go ahead.
Okay, well, I was recently listening to a podcast called In Our Time, and they have basically what they do is like from the BBC. What they do is they take experts, and they bring the experts out, and they talk about a political. They talk about a certain issue, not political issues, but just any historical. Actually, the four main categories are science, religion, history, culture. Yeah, those are the main ones. Well, philosophy too. And they had an episode on toleration, which is if that in British history that was the word for religious tolerance, toleration. That means religious toleration. And we're allowing everyone to have a certain religion. And he said that I think in the 1700s, and I guess they were talking about there was like the act of toleration in English history, and what that did was it said, well, you can have that's the big one, or that's like their Magna Carta, and they said, well, the act of toleration was not all that free, because the Magna Carta it allowed some Protestants, most Protestants, except for it was like, well, it allowed religious freedom except for Catholics, excluded all Catholics, and some Protestants were outlawed. And among the Protestants were the Muggletonians. The Muggletonians were people who considered that they considered that the religious leaders were like prophets, or they thought that, or they're one of the Quakers, or one of the Muggletonians is considered to be, one of the early Quakers is considered to, well, he was persecuted for blasphemy because he basically dressed up like Jesus and paraded himself down the streets, and people greeted him with Hosanna, Hosanna to the Lord of the Highest. They acted like he was God. And then and it's an interesting story, and many people think Cromwell is some kind of evil monster, but there's just this interesting story about Cromwell, about that same person. When this guy was put on trial for blasphemy, I mean, they did all these kinds of tortures against him, and they were about to kill him, and he said, no, 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 don't kill him. Cromwell said, no, don't kill him. I mean, you look at what happened to Christ last time. We might be killing the real Christ. This man could be Christ, we just don't know. And then they spared him, but then he got whipped and beaten and branded with a B on his forehead, and that was like considered the humane punishment back then. And then one of the main writers said that politics was, prior to the modern era, especially just after the Reformation, politics was religion, and religion was politics was religion, and religion was politics. And it's not just because Protestantism, it was just that everyone was a Christian. The state was connected to religion, and it was like to allow heresy was insane. Of course, they thought that it was just so evil and intolerable because of the religious conflicts that existed in the past. So of course it had to ban Protestantism, and also Protestantism. I mean, Luther would have said the king should follow like my orders. He should be listening to me. So of course it was like there were conflicts on both sides in that context. So of course, yeah, all that had happened. And also the point is that when people talk about religious freedom in the West, we love it so much, but the only reason it exists is because during the Reformation, people fought so much, just got tired of fighting, and they said it's better just to let live instead of killing each other. That's the only reason we love it so much today. Okay, that's all I want to say. Also, I'm reading a book right now about the founding fathers, and part of it to learn more about their ideas, but also because this is just one of the questions I'm very wondering, like what was their intended ideas for American religion, or what do they really want in American society? That's okay. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting what you were saying about freedom. Uh, kind of to the sense that we don't have to execute heretics because God is angry with us, or just because our worldview is so different now. And I kind of, and I don't know how accurate this is, but I have also kind of looked at the Reformation as kind of the start of that, where after all the wars and the killing, people were just kind of got fed up and go, man, what there has to be a different way. And I don't really know the progression of that, but it frightens me a little bit that there are Christians that, again, we were talking about dominionists earlier, that there are dominionists that think that we should execute heretics and people that, adulterers and Sabbath breakers, and it's a minority, but
Rushdoony advocating for the deaths of adulterers and homosexuals.
Yeah, exactly, and that again, it is a minority. I mean, of people, but it disturbs me as a Christian. It disturbs me that people would say that. And again, this is because I'm raised in the culture. I'm a product of the culture I was born into. But I'm certain I would probably feel very different if I was born in the 4th century listening to John Chrysostom preach, inspiring sermons one day and then, anti-Jewish rants on another day. But it's still, I'm very thankful that I am a part of the culture that I'm a part of and not a different culture that simply willfully, say, yeah, we need to execute these people. It's a really interesting history of Christianity that it has lots of dark sides to it, and lots of Christians, particularly in America, do never want to recognize that there's complexity to it.
Oh yeah, I feel like it's I hate to be an asshole. To quote Heraclitus, most men are bad, and I feel like most people are stupid. Most people don't want to look at complexity. Most people don't study the experts. Most people don't try to get educated on these issues and read books because frankly it's too bothersome, and they trust small, lesser sources of information. They don't want to get into academic stuff, and lots of people, right-wing people I talk to on the internet, all my right-wing friends are concerned about that. Kind of worries, That's another thing about that related to that is sometimes I'll read a book, and I'm wondering if is it ridiculous? Is this all lies? I thought, like, what if I read an academic source and it said this all isn't true? That's something I worry about because I hear certain, like meth stuff from a certain. It's when you look at a political issue only from like say if you're a vegetarian, if you only read Reason.com, you're going to get a very biased source of information. That happens with every media outlet from every sort of political source. I'm not trying to say, I think pretty much every media outlet distorts information just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, just for me, I mean, one of the most frustrating things for me was for me even when I was an evangelical was I would read the Bible and would hear something preached on a particular passage in the Bible, and I would read the passage, and I'm like, well, that's not exactly what this is saying, is it? There's this radical disconnect between what certain Christians teach and preach and what the Bible actually does, and that's actually one of the things that really started to get me into actually studying the Bible, like the history of it, and beginning to read, like
the Catholics up by telling you not to read the Bible and then distorting the image because no one can read it.
Yeah. And so I began to dig into the Bible, and it was like the history of it, and one of the big things for me, someone once asked me this question: how do you know the Gospel of Mark was written by a guy named Mark? And that was mind-blowing to me because I'm skeptical by nature, and at certain times in my life I've tried to suppress that. But that question just hit me, and I'm like, how do I know this? Because somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that I had read that in the manuscripts they're not signed, they're anonymous. I mean, the King James Bible says the Gospel according to Mark, but the manuscripts don't say that. The earliest manuscripts, it's just completely anonymous. And that was kind of like the linchpin for me, where I'm like, oh, okay, I have to understand what's going on here with this. And so for the last 15 years, I've been reading this and studying all these different things. And so today I look back and go, I'm glad I did this, but then I get frustrated with people who read the Bible as just like a devotional, but don't actually, they're not reading it for its context, for the history of it. There's so much history in it and I'm a history geek, so I love all this stuff. And if you're just reading it as a devotional to inspire your personal spirituality, I think that's great. What frustrates me is when people use it in a devotional manner, but to impose their own authority on someone else, which kind of goes back to an earlier discussion we had about authoritarianism. So.
I guess I'll say this one thing. After I read the New Testament, I felt kind of empowered, because when someone, now it sort of feels like whenever somebody says, well, this passage, well, the New Testament is, I think if someone said, I don't know, the New Testament, Paul thinks the world's going to end. I don't see that. It's like, well, no, because I've read that whole thing. He doesn't say that ever. That's you project, and that's more or less like you projecting your ideas onto it. I don't see that in the text at all. You have to argue from it. It sort of feels like before I would hear someone ask someone, Paul thinks it's better to be celibate than to be married, and this is because of that. And I'm like, that doesn't imply that in the least. So yes, now I can just sort of basically argue from the text, because now I have read the text. I can actually talk about what's in it. And that was the thing. I sort of felt like that was the one thing that would annoy me about my own personality. The way I read the Bible is I would try to read it as if maybe someone who had never read it before, someone from China in the 15th century, if they read it, how they would feel about it and what they think. That's the kind of approach I had to reading New Testament when I read it. And every other one had this sort of view that this is like they sort of worshipped the text when they were reading it. They sort of had this sort of devotional tone. You can't joke about it. You can't feel about it. You can't really analyze it. You have to have this sort of sacred idea that you are reading the literal words of God, all that stuff. But no, I just had this kind of casual attitude about reading about it, and that attitude goes into my interpretation of it.
I think it's important to remember that the Bible is not a book. It's a library of a bunch of books. So we can't read it as if it's one document. And the Council of Nicaea decided what was going to go in it. Plus, King James was a Catholic, okay? And he told the translators how to translate in many cases.
I'm pretty sure that's illegal because the Church of England had abolished the Catholic Church at that point in history. King James, is it King James the First? King James was a divine right monarch. He made a speech about that.
Yes, but he was a Catholic sympathizer, and he was not in favor of having the Catholic Church
He's a Catholic sympathizing Protestant, but then he's not a Catholic. Also, a fun fact about the King James.
All right, that's fair. He was a sympathizing Protestant. But he still didn't want it to contradict Catholic theology.
Yeah. One thing I want to state about just the King. The thing about that is that King Henry VIII and his son, I guess maybe his descendants until Elizabeth, King Henry VIII was a sympathetic Catholic, but then he decided that he was going to be the divine right monarch. So he got rid of his belief in the Pope, but he kept all the liturgy and so on and so forth.
Yeah, he broke away from Rome, and then he had to come up with some reason that to convince the people why he had the right to rule. So he came up with the divine right of kings, which
That's all British nonsense. No, no, no. The divine right of kings had existed for a long time, but that was something. It was kind of a political. It was based on the kind of early Protestant mindset. It's like people in the medieval era didn't know much about the world, so their idea, or what they valued, they tried to put their ideas of the church into that, and they valued a sort of the only kind of main authorities they could think of besides the Pope was the king, and then they thought, well, let's have the king be head of the church. That's what divine right monarchy existed. I mean, basically, divine right monarchy is an almost exclusively Protestant idea.
But some of the conservative writers who were pro divine rights, they were talking about how the Protestant line, the Tudors, descended from Adam, and this is where John Locke came in when he started saying they don't have divine rights because God gave man the right to rule over the earth and the fishes in the plural.
You mean patriarcha? You mean patriarcha? I mean, I feel like you have to show me those sources, but yeah.
Well, it's in two treaties to second treaties to government.
Filmer, the person that he was responding to. Phil, I've read part of Patriarcha, which was the book that John Locke was responding to.
Yeah.
He does say that he thinks that it's the proper government of every man because Adam guarded over everyone as a king until he died because he was essentially the patriarch of that whole family, of the whole human family for 900 years. And John Locke said no. I mean, I feel like Filmer is. I mean, Filmer and both Filmer and Locke are speculating, but Filmer sounds a lot more reasonable to me. But I think he concedes. He doesn't think that guy is descended from it. He doesn't think that such and such monarch is descended from Adam. I don't think he ever says that. I think he says that's not the case, but it does show that human beings by nature in the state of nature, are monarchists. I think he does say that, though. He doesn't say, well, King Henry VIII is like the firstborn son of the firstborn son of all English people.
But gentlemen, I think it's important to remember that the King James Bible, the content of the King James Bible, was influenced by King James, who was a Catholic sympathizer, and it was translated from the Latin Vulgate, which is the Latin version of the New Testament, which dates back only to 1000 A.D.
Let me fact check.
I mean, we're talking about a translation of a Latin translation of a translation. Okay? So I think it's misguided to take it as the, undisputed divine word of God. The King James Bible is a translation of a translation, and King James had a great deal of influence. You know, the fall of Satan, the story of the fall of Satan, appears in the book of Enoch, which is part of the Ethiopian Bible. And we sometimes forget there's more than one Bible. The Catholic Bible, the Catholic version of the Bible, has an intertestament in it. It has a bunch of books between the Old and New Testament. Okay? So I just think it's misguided to consider the King James Version the indisputable Word of God.
Well, it was definitely Protestant. I think it was based on the predecessor of the Geneva Bible, I think, and there was a lot of footnotes in it, especially in reference to Revelation, where he was talking about how it was an attack on Rome, an attack on Babylon, so it was used politically to attack. I mean, they refer to Daniel and the four beasts and everything as they referenced that and saying he was prophesizing about Rome and the fall of Rome.
Well, okay. If you look at the Bible and you look at Revelation, Revelation has a verse, and I forget the chapter and verse, but it says concerning the judgment day, it says, "And all whose names were not written in the Lamb's book of life were cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death." Okay? So I really don't think there's any justification for believing that hell is eternal. It sounds to me like when that's described in Revelations, they're cast in a lake of fire and they're dead for real, forever. So I think it's a bad criticism of Christianity to say, well, you know, they condemn people to eternal hellfire. That's a throwback to the Greek conception of Tartarus. And, you know, I just don't think there's any justification for saying there's an eternal hell there.
What passage does it? Are you talking about where it, in reference to hell?
I'm talking about in Revelations where it describes the judgment day.
All right.
And it says, all whose names were not written in the Lamb's book of life were cast into the lake of fire, which is the second death. Now that implies to me they cease to exist. You know, you're destroyed, and that's the end of it.
Well, just before I log off for the night, because I have to get up early in the morning, I will just say that as someone who's been Eastern Orthodox for 14 years, this is my personal view. May not be biblical, but from the tradition that I've been a part of, I adhere to. I follow Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who's basically a universalist. Eventually, everyone will be saved. So that's where my spirituality is at this point. Is it biblical? Probably. Again, depends on what you mean by biblical, but probably not. But that's the tradition that I'm going to follow. Right or wrong.
Okay, well, I started out a Southern Baptist, and now I'm a shamanist. You know, the Southern Baptists still have me on the books, and because they believe in once in grace, always in grace. You know, I can claim to be a Christian as well, and I did study the Bible in depth when I was younger, and I have come to the conclusion that I accept only those things which are attributed as being the word of Christ. The rest of it, I don't really adhere to in any way. The teachings of Christ are all that I accept, and as a shamanist, I also accept the teachings of Buddha and God's other special people. My own personal belief is that the entire cosmos is the body of God, and that cosmic consciousness is what we call God. It is aware, it is alive, and that's the way I look at it. And of course, we're not evangelical, so I'm not trying to convince anybody to agree with me. To answer your question, yes. Everything in the universe is part of the body of God. You and me and everybody else. Now, I'm no more important than a mitochondria in a single cell myself. But yeah, we're all part of the matrix. We're all part of it.
Do you believe in
Everything.
you believe like everything, all of our constructs of like attachment, our ideas of like good and bad are all constructs, and deep down everything's perfect, like a Taoist?
I, I'm not sure. I know what you're saying, but I think that the consciousness itself is not part of the um, material. I think that's that. Um, I think it borders on Freemasonic or materialistic when you start saying that we are the material.
Wizard person with a wizard with a Gandalf as his profile picture. I'm asking you back if he's a pantheist.
What was that?
But you see, Native Americans and various tribes around the world, you know, they look at things a little differently. They call their people medicine men. The Catholics call their people priests. I'm an Anglo-Saxon. We call our holy men wizards. Okay, so and that's the way I look at it. I think if you were to take a time-lapse photograph of a mountain, right? If you could film a frame a day for a million years, you would see something that looked like a living creature when you played the film back. Stars are the equivalent of mitochondria. They're the powerhouse. They produce the energy, and they make chemical reactions. And if you look at all the things going on out there, I think you could make a case that a galaxy looks like a living organism. I don't want to hug the conversation, guys, but if no one else is going to talk, I will.
Chuck, can you tell me like your religion? Like you can type it. Type like your religious ideas.
Well, I believe that you know, the quantum mechanics tell us that when you look at the universe, the cosmos, on the most microscopic quantum levels, it looks really similar to data storage. All right. And I don't see any reason why, when we die, our consciousness is not uploaded to the cosmic consciousness, and that's what I believe happens. I think that it can be downloaded again. I think you know, in India, if you look at India, uh, there's no question in the mind of Indians that reincarnation is real. They've got tens of thousands of incidents that they've recorded and studied where people under the age of 3 were talking about being street sweepers or whatever, somebody in the next village or whatever. And when they take these kids to talk to relatives of the person they say they are, the relatives say, "My God, that's him. He knows everything about it. He knows everything about the man's life, and so forth." And the major objection to reincarnation, of course, is everybody's a king, everybody's a prince. Well, that's not true. In the literature in India, people live very many mundane lives. In fact, it's very rare to see someone who's been a king or whatever. And they just look at it and investigate it like any other phenomenon. And they say, you know, when we bring the relatives of this fellow that this kid says he is, the reincarnation of, and they talk, he knows all about the guy's life. The relatives confirm it. They say he sounds like him. And even Carl Sagan, you know, an atheist, famous atheist scientist, said that reincarnation deserves really serious scientific investigation. You know, I think we're missing the boat by being totally materialistic with our science. You know, people, when they die on the operating table and they manage to bring them back, people inevitably come back and say, yes, I was out of my body, I was watching everything you did, and they give accurate descriptions of what the doctors did while they were supposedly dead. So I think that there's plenty of evidence that there's a heck of a lot more to all this than the scientists claim. You know, the materialistic, atheistic scientists claim.
And there's
And getting back to the New Testament, okay, there are a lot of Christians that believe, the Earth is 6,000 years old or whatever, uh, and they look at Genesis, you know, and the evening and the morning was the first day, and all that. Well, day, okay, that's what the King James interpreters, translators, decided to call a certain Jewish word. All right, the word day in the King James Bible is the Jewish word or Hebrew word yom, Y-O-M. It does not refer to a 24-hour day. It refers to an unspecified period of time. It could be a week, a year, a millennium, a geologic epoch. There's no time period assigned to it. It just means some time passed. Might have been a really long time, might have been a short time. Okay, and I think that's where we miss out by not looking at the original languages involved.
well, where does it come from? Day? Is that close to something like aeon? Then more meaning closer to aeon, like what the Gnostics would say.
Well, yeah, the word day is the Hebrew word yom, and it's an unspecified period of time. It can be any length of time. And let's not forget that the sun and the moon weren't even created until the third day. Okay? So how can we say that's a 24-hour day that is being referred to when the sun and the moon weren't even there until the third day? I stand corrected. It was the fourth day. Sorry about that. My point is, whatever you believe, accept the teachings of God's special people like Christ and Buddha. Okay? Christ said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Buddha said, don't do anything to anybody else that you wouldn't want done to you. I mean, there are universal themes throughout virtually all the religions. Okay? And the theme is love one another, be good to one another. And by the way, in my religion, respect for nature is paramount because every piece of nature is a part of God and must be respected and honored and cherished and, helped in any way you can. So I just don't understand all the confusion. Christians should be able to get along with Buddhists very easily. Buddha even said, don't believe anything anybody tells you or anything you read, even if I tell you, if it doesn't agree with your common sense and sense of rationality. One thing I will tell you, if somebody tells you your religion requires you to hate other people or kill other people, you tell them they're full of shit.
Where's that background noise coming from? Do you have machinery going on in the background? Sounds like a jackhammer.
I don't have any jackhammers.
Okay. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Good night. Yeah.
Good night, sir.
Well, but sweet.
Has anybody ever noticed that the order in which the plants and animals and everything were created in Genesis agrees with the order that they arose in evolution? I mean, I look at it like Genesis tells us what God did, evolution tells us how he did it. And the vast majority of Christians worldwide are theistic evolutionists. That's just the way God did it. It doesn't rule God out in any way. Well, the fact remains that the order in Genesis that the plants and animals arose are the same as the order in the theory of evolution.
Yeah, but you couldn't, if someone has, say, from the 10th century, let's say, read those passages in the Bible, they would not get the impression at all that it was talking about evolution. So it's sort of like the link between that and what we actually find when we observe things is it's a bit tenuous. So I don't know. I don't buy it.
Well, do you want to try to explain to ancient Hebrews the theory of evolution? I mean, in those days, the way to explain it is the way they explained it in Genesis. You know, they had no conception of evolution or genetics or anything like
Well,
that.
yes, you could, hypothetically. Like, so say, okay, hypothetical situation, we get a time machine and we go back to, I suppose, pre-Babylonian captivity, Israel. And, people in those days still had things like domesticated breeding. So you could say, well, you guys have domesticated breeding. You understand that you have crops and you have livestock. Actually, let's just go with wheat or barley. That might make the example simpler. And when you plant your seeds, you want to select the plants that have that produce the most food or whatever, the most productive plants out of all of the barley plants or whatever there are in the field. And that accumulates over the generations. And then you could explain to them that this sort of thing happens in the wild as well, but with different pressures and different characteristics. So you could find a way to explain in that, so is that hypothetical?
Well, another example, the concepts of evolutionary thought extend back pretty far into prehistory, into at least at early antiquity. In ancient Greece, you had Anaximander, who was formulating ideas about pre-existence of certain creatures. He theorized that some of the first creatures that existed first in the water during a wet phase and eventually became land animals. So I mean, they're very basic and rudimentary ideas, but people were formulating theories about where animals came from. A lot of philosophers were naturalistic in the very general sense that they were unalterable physical forms, that a bird is a bird, a rat is a rat, a fish is a fish. But there were examples in different parts of the world, in ancient Greece, in imperial China, in Egypt, and later on, Islamic scholars would formulate certain ideas that resembled what we would think of as pre-modern evolutionary theory. And these things developed over time when people were able to discuss these ideas in certain times when philosophy was able to flourish. So it is possible that in the right environment, in the right place in the world at a certain time, that you could eventually explain to a group of people the concept of evolution in a way that perhaps they would be able to understand, at least from a rudimentary perspective. I'm pretty sure of that.
I absolutely agree with that. What I'm saying is that ancient Israel, 4,000 years ago, was not that time and place.
Sicker than your average nigger killer, twist niggers' heads on.
You gotta give him some credit for his creativity.
Don't really like the music though. Do you?
Oh yeah, you got a good beat.
Yeah.
Horrible message, but whatever.
And look at the scientists, what they say about how the universe came into existence, the Big Bang Theory, which I do subscribe to, and I subscribe to the oscillating universe theory. I think there's going to be a big crunch and another Big Bang. But if you look at that, the scientists are kind of saying, give us one great big-ass miracle, and then we will explain everything that happens after that.
You could look at it that way. You could also take a look, once again, at classical philosophy. The Stoics believed in something called the conflagration, that the world was born out of fire and that it would return to fire. You have similar concepts in Hindu cosmology of different stages of existence, extending far back into into a primal existence, into primal creation. But there again, each sect and each philosophical school had different concepts and how they emerged that. The Orphics had a very complex view of the Orphic egg and different emanations that were manifestations of earlier deities. So it really depends on what culture you're talking about. You can use a lot of the same symbolism and attach those to modern concepts of science, but ultimately when you're looking at pre-modern cultures that didn't have what we would consider the scientific method, a lot of these can be designated to any arbitrary definition. You can make any connections that you want. I don't think that it's particularly valuable to necessarily connect things to one thing or another. Science is science, and religion ultimately is religion, and they don't necessarily have to be one and the same in all instances, though one can make those correlations. Everything is shades of gray.
Absolutely, and all knowledge is contingent. Okay? When you get to the higher levels of abstraction, you've got to remember that those concepts are totally dependent on all the simpler concepts that came before. And if you made the tiniest mistake at the beginning or in the middle, your ultimate concepts will be incorrect.
Yeah, I think modern materialistic science tends to not really give credit where it's due to religion or ancient teachings based on that go back from. I think there's truths in them, like for example the Trinity. It's the Trinity you can find throughout nature. It's a real thing. It's just I think like mind, matter, and soul. Probably not the best example, but there are truths that are. It's like a guide, I think, for science. If scientists give it its credit.
Well, let's look at the scientific argument. Well, not an argument even. They say, okay, there is no God. And then when you say, okay, prove it, what did they say? You cannot prove a universal negative, right? That's their get out of jail free card. Now, I'm sorry, but when you make the statement, I don't believe there's a God because I don't find the evidence compelling, that's a fair, rational statement. But when you make the statement, there is no God, there definitely is no God, and there can be no God, you're making a positive statement about the nature of the universe, and you are required to prove that.
Yeah, and the burden of evidence lies on materialist, because no materialist has ever found any substance.
Well,
I mean,
let's look at this dogma. Let's look at this dogma that you can't prove a universal negative. If you look at relativity physics, and all you need is one proof by counterexample to destroy a dogma, right? In relativity physics, they have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is no such thing as any material object anywhere in space-time that it can exceed the speed of light.
Yeah. Well,
They have proven a universal negative. So no, I'm sorry. When the atheist says I don't have to prove my position, you say yes, you do, because a universal negative can be proven, and your dogma has been disproven. Objects can move twice the speed of light outside of space-time, not inside space-time, and that is relativity. Well, gosh, the silence is deafening. I think that God does exist. Everybody, you know, a lot of people tell me, well, your definition of God, no, Salitris is the speed of light in a vacuum. 2c is not possible inside space-time according to the theory of relativity. The limited velocity is the speed of light in a vacuum. No material object can exceed that inside space-time. I'm sorry.
Actually, in relativity, from an outside observer, two objects moving away from each other at the speed of light can reach a maximum of 2c, but you can't exceed 2c.
Actually, from the viewpoint of an outside observer, if two objects are moving at the speed of light away from each other, you will calculate that to be the speed of light.
No, it's actually twice the speed of light.
Well, you would think so, but that's not what the theory of relativity says.
Actually, you would think it would be c because it's commonly believed that c is the maximum, but it's actually 2c. An object moving if an object's moving to the left at the speed of light, and then one's moving to the right away from that one at the speed of light, someone outside of that observing that is going to observe those.
Bob, sicker than your average nigger killer twist.
Classy, very classy.
Can we have some rock?
Can't these kind of trolls come up with something different? I mean, seriously, that's as old as...
Lynch viewers do something to us. Talk go through us, your mom walk to us. Get on the rape bus. Screw us. To us.
It's okay to make fun of black people because they're inferior to whites.
Nigger.
So how long has he been doing that? I'm just curious.
That's number 3.
Well, there's no reason to let some dumb shit disrupt our rational conversation here. So I pay no attention to that crap.
Well, personally, I find it funny that a troll like that is just going to drum up such an old tactic that's just really just unoriginal. I mean, please, if you're going to troll the room, at least do it originally.
How should I troll originally?
Let me ask you this, Adam. Let me ask you this, Adam. You're traveling at the speed of light, and you've got headlights on your spaceship, and you turn them on. Are the headlights going to travel faster than the speed of light?
Well, no, because the headlights are going to be moving in the same direction as you. But if you assume that you're static and you're traveling at the speed of light, and something's moving away from you at the speed of light, to an outside observer...
Bob.
Should we fire Ruben for being a bad admin here? He said he wouldn't do it. He said it wouldn't happen again, but it happened again.
If you're traveling at the speed of light in a vacuum and you turn the lights on going forward,
Never lose, never choose.
you're not. The answer is it's not possible to turn the lights on because time stands still when you're traveling at the speed of light. So you can't do anything. You can't turn the lights on.
Right, but the lights in the back will okay, look, if you're traveling at the speed of light, I mean, you can't travel at the speed of light, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, pretend that you can travel at the speed of light, and then you send a light beam away from you to a third observer, assuming that you're not moving, to a third observer who's watching you, but assuming that you're not moving, the light that you sent out is going to appear to move at twice the speed of light. That's what Einstein, that's what relativity says. But you have to have a third observer, and you have to assume that you are static. You have to assume that you're at rest.
Even though you're traveling at the speed of light.
Well, in relativity, you have that concept that you can't really establish who's at rest, right? Like that's kind of the whole reason why it's called relativity. So if you assume that, let's say that you're particle A, and then particle B is moving away from you at the speed of light. Particle A is moving to the left at the speed of light. To observer C outside of that, if C assumes that A is at rest, then B is moving at 2C. It's moving at twice the speed of light. If you think about what it is, it seems very obvious, but we're so conditioned to believe that you can't exceed the speed of light that you wouldn't think that it's possible. But that's what relativity says.
Well, I'm not sure where you're getting your information, but I hang out with relativity physicists, and there's no relativity physicist which would ever say that any observer would ever calculate that your speed was greater than the speed of light in a vacuum, which is the limiting velocity. It's common sense that it would be, but they say it's counterintuitive, and it would look like they were traveling away from each other at the speed of light. That's what the scientists say. Now, you may be right, Adam. Okay, you may be right in your assessment, but if you say relativity physicists agree with you, that's not correct.
So you're saying that Albert Einstein, who wrote that something can go at 2C, is wrong, and that the people that you hang out with are right? But Albert Einstein,
I don't believe Einstein wrote that. All right, I'm saying I don't believe Einstein wrote that. And you may be honestly mistaken. I'm not saying you're an asshole who's telling lies. I'm saying you may be honestly mistaken about it.
No, I appreciate that too. I don't think that you're coming off as an asshole who's telling lies either. But I mean, you got to admit it's possible that you are the one who's mistaken, and there is actually this relatively unknown thing where you can travel at twice the speed of light that people just aren't that aware of. Like, I wasn't aware of this until just a few months ago.
Well, let's also
I have to admit that I was mistaken once. About 5 years ago, I thought I had made a mistake.
What do you call a group of Jews on a train? Anything. They are not coming back. Joke, 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 joke.
Oh man, I kind of wanted to hear the punchline there, but you choked out. But we should not forget one thing that I think we're kind of forgetting here is that you're taking this from Einstein, and I believe that there are quite a few breakthroughs have been made on the issue of relativity since Einstein put forth. So even if Einstein wrote it, let's not forget that Einstein was in his time we're in old times, so let's try using a frame of reference for relativity that's more contemporary than just from what Einstein wrote.
So you're saying some kind of like new modified version of relativity versus actual like special and general relativity?
No, I'm saying that Einstein wrote what he wrote within his time. Quite a few advancements have been made. Let's use those models instead of what was made during Einstein's time.
Right. So what is a model that has taken relativity and kept the label relativity, but it's like a new modification of it since Einstein's time?
Well, the relativity gurus, Wheeler, Mencner, and Thorne, some 20 years ago, decided that time travel was actually theoretically possible and allowed within relativity theory. And they became quite schizophrenic and started trying to understand how the paradoxes are avoided. But it is commonly accepted among relativity physicists today that time travel is possible. And Einstein would have been horrified at that. And I should say theoretically possible because all the ways they've come up with doing it are like 100,000 years ahead of anything we can do. So it's not something to be concerned about. But the paradoxes were avoided by adopting quantum mechanics, the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics, which would maintain that if you went back and killed Hitler, you just branch.
I'm not too sure if anyone else got cut off from Wizard, but I think you got, but you know, you just stopped.
Did anyone else have anything else to say on this, or would you like to move to another topic?
Well, I gotta go, but all I just gotta do is say, God damn it, Fringy Gaming, can you just not do a live stream while I'm trying to engage in a group that I haven't been to in such a long fucking time? Jesus shit. Oh well. I'll see you guys later.
Take care. There's one thing that I wanted to say about this topic that sort of evolved, and I sort of said it in the side chat. I think it's worth mentioning. General relativity, quantum mechanics, quantum entanglement, anything having to do with theoretical physics is theoretical, and it is one of the most, if not the most, hotly debated, constantly changing, evolving form of physics and science in general. So there's going to be arguments, and people have various different understandings of physics. I don't claim to know hardly anything about it, save for what I've been able to read on the theory. I know nothing of the mathematics, but I think a lot of times it gets heated like that because people aren't able to kind of look at where they actually get their information from, and don't qualify what they're actually talking about, and it ends up becoming sort of a shouting match. That's all I wanted to say on that.
Right. Yeah. I just want to make clear. I'm not claiming that I agree with relativity or quantum mechanics or all that stuff. I'm just saying from what Einstein wrote in terms of what his theory was, there is it's not very well known, but you can have it set up if you have 3 observers where something can actually appear to go twice the speed of light. And it's kind of like this little known trivial thing of relativity that is never really talked about or like used, but
because it's dealing
set
with
up.
an aspect of general relativity that is particularly abstract. We haven't even gotten to the point of getting to a mere fraction of traveling at the speed of light. So a lot of those sort of I wouldn't say fringe questions, but those really, really theoretical concepts, the things that he was talking about in his writings, were, I mean, him really kind of putting to task the equations that he was developing, and helping for both his own matters and for others that he was trying to explain his theory to, ways in which it could be applied.
Right, but this is actually, I think, less abstract than a lot of the more well-known relativistic like thought experiments and stuff, because this actually, in this scenario, it becomes more like classical mechanics. It just becomes an ordinary I can't remember what you call it, Galilean transformation instead of the Lorentz transformations, but
That's a good point.
I don't know. I thought it was an interesting little factoid. I wasn't like trying to debate about it or something, but
No, it's, everyone has a different discussion style, and Wizard was rather intense, so I appreciate you being patient. So how have you been, Adam?
I've been doing all right.
Good. I'm glad. Welcome, Scorpio. Sorry about the mess there.
Okay. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I've just been kind of listening in there to the broadcast. Interesting topic.
Yeah.
I have a lot of different ideas, though, for at least some of this stuff. I'm not a supporter of the whole Big Bang thing, and I actually support a different cosmology. So.
Well, one of the ones that's been in discussion over the past few decades has to do with M theory, and it's this concept that it's not a singularity, a single Big Bang and a linear progression, but more like bubbles emerging from a boiling pot of water, and that what we see as a singular Big Bang is only one of several membranes emerging into a physical universe, one of many potentially limitless membranes coming into existence and coming into physical matter. So there's a lot of different views. That's only one of several different theories on how M theory, superstring theory, however you want to put it, actually works in concept, and one that's constantly debated. So there are different views than just the linear concept of the Big Bang that's out there.
Okay. No, but I think the answer could possibly be a lot more simple than that. As I said, I tend to lean more towards an electric universe concept. It's a lot more conglomerate.
Would that be Russellian?
Pardon?
Would that be based on Walter Russell's theories?
I can see where Walter Russell's work really has a lot of relationship to it, but I'm thinking more of the more modern version of the Electric Universe, Wall Thornhill, the present group of people that are working from that direction.
So what's a brief analysis of what they say?
Well, that the universe is of unknown duration. Oh no. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to mute myself here. I can hear that my cat's being sick in the back room, so I have a mess to clean up. Sorry.
It's probably a hairball.
Usually is.
Yeah, I like Walter Russell. I'm not too. I don't really. Not that. Don't know too much about Einstein really. Yeah. I like Russell. I like the way Walter Russell says there's no gravity, just magnetic still light, and gravity is nothing but the return to where things came from. Not exactly. I don't know whether that makes sense. So gravity is not a substance. It's not. It's just it's a return to like a vacuum. That's about as much as I know about it. How do you explain black holes? How do black holes fit into the Big Bang Theory? Yeah, so I don't know too much about. I'm not really that scientifically minded, so.
Fair enough.
So what you been up to? Yeah.
Not a whole lot, really. The last month has just been kind of taking care of things around the house, getting things I needed to get squared away. So it's been pretty productive, but also pretty quiet, which is good. I needed a break from a variety of different groups, online and offline. So, but it's been good. I can come at things better with renewed intention, I suppose, because I've had the break. I was able to kind of take care of everything. But it's been good. It's been real good.
You still doing that? The groups you were doing.
Yeah. And once again, it's sort of all dovetailed together. A lot of the groups have been inactive because of the holiday. A lot of people aren't doing anything during the holidays. They're spending time with family, and a lot of times it's the beginning of the year, so people are sort of spring cleaning already. They're already kind of getting things squared away before events really start. A lot of things don't even start till late February or early March, right around when it's about to be spring. So works out really well. So I took advantage of it, in other words, of the free time.
Yeah.
Yes. Nasty hairball all over the netbook in the back room. Oh well. Typical.
Thought it'd be that.
As soon as I get into doing something, there's something from one part of the family zoo here, of course. So yes, Walter Russell. His concepts are a little bit different than the wider modern iteration of the electric universe. That's more based on bits of the work from like Ralph Jurgen, Velikovsky, Hannah Salfane, for the scientific aspects of it, at least. I noticed one of the people in the room here has a Carl Sagan as an image, so have to make my comment about the Velikovsky. But
Can you repeat that, what you just said about Velikovsky?
well, I noticed one of the people in the room here, their icon is Carl Sagan, and there was a bit of a disagreement between Carl and Velikovsky there. Although I will say one thing, that it was good that he turned around and kind of stuck up for Velikovsky there right near the end, saying that, he shouldn't be blackballed just because he has ideas that are different from us. The attitude that Velikovsky was getting by mainstream science was, like he was worse than insane. So
were you saying that part of your cosmology incorporates some of Velikovsky's theories or something? I missed what you said before that.
well, they follow along the basic ideas that Velikovsky was talking about, that the dominant force in the universe isn't gravity, it's actually the electric force.
Okay.
And that's, of course, I mean, when we look at modern cosmology and that today, the dominant force is considered to be gravity. This is where they come up with their need for supermassive objects to be at the centers of galaxies, and that,
So do you not believe that there are supermassive objects at the centers of the galaxies?
Well, when I think of the idea that, okay, well, you're proposing that the weakest force known, gravity, can compress multiple solar masses of matter into physical dimensions exponentially smaller than an electron. It goes down to a single Planck, right? Well, this is the idea of the black hole. This is the the super idea of the black hole is that gravity compresses all this matter down into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller physical areas. That's why we can't see them. Not just because they're unlit, is because they're too small. And then the equations are modified back and forth depending on what they need to satisfy the equation.
Right. So you mean like the way that they'll just add like dark energy or dark matter and stuff like that because none of the math like works out?
Exactly. And yet now I'm trying to remember the names. Oh, geez. I'm kind of distracted here because I'm listening in the back room to see if the cat's going to be up chucking another hairball. But I'm trying to remember their names now. There's a couple of scientists, plasma physicists. Anthony Peratt, okay. He came up with the supercomputer model of interacting areas of plasma, two clouds of plasma. I don't like using the term cloud of plasma, but that it's about as close to the concept that as you can in describing it. But he modeled that two clouds of plasma, when they came together, that they would rotate around each other. And he, with his computer models, got bar and spiral galaxy-like formations with matching rotational curves. And then another plasma physicist by the name of Winston Bostick, he actually empirically demonstrated the concept at scale, small scale, mind you, in his lab. He actually got these two little puffs of plasma to spin around each other. Mind you, again, it's all at scale, but these forces scale up really well.
And this is all without gravity, right? This is just because of the electromagnetism in the plasma?
Yeah, it's the electric universe has reasonable, at least as far as I'm concerned, reasonable explanations for all of the observed phenomenon. I mean, there are certain limitations, simply because we don't have a way of like putting a meter on either side of a star to see if we can, empirically demonstrate that there is a feed current, a polar feed current, connecting our star to the arm of the galaxy that we're in. But there are experiments going on right now. One of the most interesting ones is the Sapphire experiment, where they're basically trying to do more modern version of Birkeland's Torella experiments.
What is that?
Basically an electric sun. Using a charged sphere. And,
what do you mean by that, though, an electric sun?
Well, in the electric universe paradigm, each star is an actively electric part of the galactic circuit.
Oh, okay.
They're fed by the field-aligned Birkeland currents traveling through the arms of the galaxy that the star resides within. And each planet acts like a homopolar motor for rotation, and in the case of Earth, it's a transformer to transform the energies from the star to a livable condition.
Wait. So in the I'm sorry, is it plasma cosmology?
Well, it can. They're very, very similar. Plasma cosmology and electric universe ideas.
Okay, right. So in the electric, is that what you're talking about, the electric universe? Like, what label would you put on the thing that you just described? Electric universe?
Well, it falls into both of them. There's minor differences between the ideas. Like one of them considers like our star to be an anode. One considers it to be a cathode.
Okay. So in the version that you were just describing, I want to see if I'm following along what you're saying. Are you saying that the Earth, for example, in orbiting the sun, that it's orbiting not because of gravity but because of some kind of electrical force? Or did I misunderstand that part?
Well, yeah. What it's doing is it's fitting into a specific frequency-related ring that relates to the overall composition of the planet.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize that. I've read a little bit about some of these like electric theories and stuff, but I thought it was more on like galactic scale and higher than that. But I didn't realize that it goes all the way down to like the planetary scale. That's cool.
Oh, well, actually, that's one of the things that I really like about it, is the fact that it seems to be able to link from basically the atomic all the way up to the cosmic scale.
Right.
There's no need for all the rest of the the tinkerings that they put in. There's no need for dark matter. There's no need for dark energy. There's explanations for the supposed missing mass problem with the rotational curves. There's an explanation for redshift, that it's not expanding.
What do you know more about that? Like, what is the explanation then?
The idea for that is it's well, there's a couple of different points that are related to plasma and electrical events. We've demonstrated or has been demonstrated in various labs. I'm not saying I did. I'm not a scientist, but there are experiments where they've fired various types of light, lasers, etc., through different plasmas, and they've been able to duplicate spectral shifts to the light traveling through the plasma. So there's your red shift, blue shift. And not only that, but they can refract. I don't know whether I've got it on this browser or not. I've got a bunch of links that I could put in the side chat if they're on this one or whether I have to go to my other browser. There was an article in Science Daily where they were making observations of a quasar, and the quasar appeared in multiple locations, and they couldn't figure out why it was happening until they realized that there was unlit gases as they like to call them, dark mode plasmas. There are 3 distinct modes for plasma. There's dark mode, where the atoms and that within it aren't energized enough to start producing light on the visible scale. Then there's glow mode, which is what we see in fluorescent lights. And then there's arc mode, which is discharge. Everything from the little tiny spark you get, dragging your feet across the rug and touching the doorknob, to lightning bolts, right?
Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, there's the link for the Milky Way gas cloud causes multiple images of distant quasar.
Sweet.
So they know this can happen. There's also the work by I can see the name, I can see the face, but I can't remember the name right offhand. Oh man.
Can I ask you, in the electric universe and the like all the stuff you're talking about, do they try to replace other forces with electric explanations, like the strong nuclear force and weak nuclear force, or do they still use those?
Most of the people that are in direct members of the Thunderbolts group, thunderbolts.info, they lean towards a more normal version of the atom, and I kind of lean more towards a wave model of the atom myself, rather than either the nuclear or quantum model.
So, but do you believe that there are like right now in mainstream science, you have the 4 forces, right? Like of gravity, electromagnetism, and then the weak and strong nuclear force, right?
Yes.
And so do you believe in gravity, or do you think it's all electric?
I think gravity is a kind of like a 3-dimensional specific oscillation related to a specific collection of matter.
So are you saying you don't even think it's a force? Or that it derives more from an electric?
Yeah,
I think it's a return to a resting point myself. I don't think it's a force. I think you can call it a substance or anything like that. I think it's just return to a vacuum.
Walter Russell described it as basically returning to rest.
Yeah.
Because that's where everything tries to achieve is either rest or charge balance, right?
Mm-hmm. So do you believe? I guess what I'm trying to say, like, a long time ago, I had this, like, when I was a kid, like, it was kind of like corny, but I had this theory that everything was magnetism. Like, there's nothing but like every force was just a form of magnets. There wasn't any nuclear force. There wasn't any gravity. It was all just like I was like playing with magnets, and I was like everything has to be magnetic. I think that's. I mean, looking back, I think that's kind of silly, but it sounds kind of similar to that. Are you saying that electromagnetism is like the fundamental force, and everything else is like some secondary consequence of that, or is there other forces beyond electromagnetism?
I'd say that it's all electromagnetism. I think that everything in the material world is electric. That's what Walter Russell's saying. Everything that manifests in the material world is some magnetic frequency. It's all motion. There is no actual. For example, like if you get a coin and you spin it round, it looks like a globe, but it's actually the illusion of motion. There isn't actually. It's just the particles moving so fast in waveforms that they appear solid and like object. And when they come back to the resting point, that is magnetic. What Walter Russell calls magnetic still light, which is the gravity that is at the root of everything.
Loving Singleton, if you want to go ahead and talk, you can.
Hello. I'm not sure how to respond to all that talk about magneticism and sort of pantheism.
Okay.
Fair enough.
You want to? Do you have a different topic you want to talk about or something?
How'd you get it?
I'm sorry. What's that?
I guess I can tell you this. I said earlier when I was in here, I mentioned a podcast called In Our Time. I recently watched an episode on electricity, and how that worked. Mentioned was, you know, John Wesley. John Wesley. He was the founder of Methodism. He was. I mean, it's just sort of, you know, they tried to use electricity in medicine because they knew that it worked in the human body in some way. And originally they thought that, so they tried to use it for medicine. Also, by the way, it's interesting that at that period in history, for poor people, you know, basically you could only really afford to go to a doctor if you were rich or if you were of the upper class. Poor people would often agree test subjects for certain medical experiments, and the state didn't do anything about it. But yeah, so this all happened, and you know, when they were. But the other point is that early on, many people thought that electricity might be a panacea. It might be the all medicine, the all cure for everything, and that it would be, you know, kind of John Wesley had this glorified view of it. He was an advocate for electricity in medicine, and he thought that it might be the medicine for the poor, because until that period in history, you could only afford medicine if you were rich. And he thought this might be the medicine for the poor, the great secret. And he regarded, I mean, he sort of regarded medicine as a conspiracy of the rich against the poor. People just, you know, rich people trying to pretend they have the ability to cure diseases when they couldn't. Which back then, I mean, that's not all unbelievable, considering many people died in hospitals as opposed to outside of hospital. But yeah, he thought that you could have this. Yeah, he thought that electricity might be a panacea. And if you go to old Methodist houses, you know, old Methodist churches, you can, you know, see they have electrical conductors to administer electricity. And of course, back then, I mean, there's a common you know, out of all that logic came Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was essentially based off, you know, kind of in the same way modern sci-fi is largely based off of certain ideas about people point out that sci-fi largely plays on the themes of that day, the scientific themes of that day. Like in, you know, Spider-Man, you had some kind of like radioactive spider, and later on it was a genetically modified spider. That's because back then they thought that radioactivity might have some kind of like serious scientific potential to be, for use in everything. And then now we think genetic modification could be seriously powerful, but neither of those scientific theories even make sense when applied to like what could give someone superpowers when it comes to spiders. But yeah, it was like that. They thought that, so yeah, but Mary Shelley's Frankenstein reflects that, because back then they tried to make electricity, but they tried to think electricity had this kind of great medical potential, and then they thought, well, what if we just had this, this novel about some man who is, and try to animate dead body parts, and this human being comes back to life.
Yeah.
After,
Yeah. Frankenstein. That was written. That was like. That was written. That was the beginning of the Gothic period, which was, I think, was a response to the Enlightenment, and one of the problems, like you say, with the Enlightenment of trying to reduce man down to nuts and bolts, and then the Gothic novel became really popular because people wanted to return to the spiritual side, where I think it had been suppressed by the Enlightenment, which was I think tried to elevate man's reason above anything supernatural. Yeah, I was just agreeing with what you were saying.
The devices you were describing there that people were using for health, that wouldn't happen to be a violet ray device, would you? Would you know?
I don't believe so.
Okay, because there was a number of different electrical type devices in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I happen to have one here in the room with me too.
The other thing I talked about in that podcast was that back then, in order to get funding for science, or it didn't even get funding per se, but you needed to sort of, I think you had to have scientific, I'm not sure how, but I know that to make money, to get money to fund science, you would have to prove in some way that you were producing something of value. And they would do that mainly by like having shows, like using science as entertainment. So back then, I mean, a world with like candlelight, in order to prove that they were trying to do something important, they would run electricity through a glass bottle, and that would produce artificial light, and that would shock people, and they would all be very excited, and then that's how they got funding for electrical research.
Well, of course, that brings us right to Tesla, right? Because he was, at the time, the ultimate showman for the electrical age.
I didn't ever heard of it before, but I could imagine such, as back then you needed to be a showman more than science, more to like get funding.
Well, that is a definite shame, because without Tesla, we would be nowhere. The world that we love so much today would not be. There wouldn't be AC power the way we have it now.
Microwaves.
Oh, he came up with a whole bunch of different things before it was all kind of upended.
You can look up all of the scientific patents if you want, like everything that he ever made and all the contributions. It's like, I think one of the things he did is what I heard. I think he actually, I think he would do what he would do is he would make something like, I think like the other kind of main electric scientist in his day was what's that guy? The Americans think he made the light bulb. Edison. He'd piss Edison off because Edison would make something and then Tesla would make something more for Edison. The great thing about Edison, I think he made a lot of things, but I think the great thing to know about Edison is that he invented the movie camera. And because of that, we have film. And now we have film industry. We wouldn't have film without Tesla. Without Edison.
Well, the big thing between Edison and Tesla was the current wars. Edison was trying to promote his DC power system, and he actually employed Tesla for a little while, and he basically made a handshake deal with Tesla that if Tesla did what he could to help improve Edison's products, and that he would give him a certain amount of money, which in that day, was a fair bit of money. And when Tesla did this, he went up to Edison. He says, "Well, there, I've done what you wanted." And Edison was such a nice guy. He said, "Oh, gee, you thought I was serious. Oh, you don't know about our American sense of humor. I was only joking about that." So basically, he ripped Tesla off for a serious amount of money. Tesla immediately quit and went to work as a ditch digger.
That's so evil. So messed up. Also, I can't help but mention this fact about Tesla. You might have seen the meme, like the picture. It's like a picture of Tesla with a sort of meme background, and then it says, "Handsome, irresistible to women, in love with a pigeon, celibate and in love with a pigeon."
Well, that's in reference to the way he ended his life. He came up with a way to transmit power wirelessly to every home. It was going to be a method of communication, and he got the backing of J.P. Morgan, the richest man in the world at the time. But when Morgan found out that it was going to actually let every homeowner tap into Earth's natural electricity, and he had no way of putting a meter on it, he immediately yanked all of his funding. I'm sure was involved in the men that turned around and subsequently burnt Tesla's work to the ground, his factory. It was pretty sad. Going back to Edison, when they were having the current wars, you know that Edison created the electric chair, right?
No, I did not know that. Go on.
Yeah, he created the electric chair to show the dangers of AC power, which was the power system that Tesla was trying to forward. The biggest difference between them is with Edison's system, you would have had to have a power generation station about every 10 miles maximum. So, he stood to make a lot of money from a very inefficient power system. And he tried to show that, Tesla's system was so dangerous. He went on traveling shows around the country, electrocuting any stray dogs that could be caught. He even electrocuted an elephant just to show how dangerous AC power was.
We should have tested it on JP Morgan.
Yeah, well, again, like I said, J.P. Morgan, as soon as he found out that there was no way he was going to be able to put a meter on it, that's it, cut off all his funding. He sent a bunch of guys in there and used his influence to convince the local governments and unions and that the building that he was making the tower in that was going to cause earthquakes and all of these disasters, and it basically pumped the fear level up. And of course, they went in and cease and desist and tore the tower down. And when Tesla died, the FBI walked in there and basically confiscated anything that they hadn't, managed to get their hands on in times before that.
So when was all this uncovered? When did they find out that it wasn't that harm?
Oh well, I mean that's the way it was left. That it was just this is so potentially dangerous. We can't allow anything like that. Like it's too much of a threat to us.
Oh yeah, by the way, I also kind of thought Tesla. I think he wrote something about we don't have the notes, but he says at one point that I've been thinking about constructing a ray that could, like, I think it was destroy a house in 50 miles or something.
He did have an idea for a death ray. As a matter of fact, that's why he was used as the idea for the villain in the very first Superman animated cartoon.
What was his name? The villain's
name. Basically, the character was based on Tesla because he had told the military that he could make this ray that would basically, make the atom bomb look like a joke. Much more targeted, no fallout.
What was it going to think about? That relates to the thing I was going to argue about Tesla. When before you said about the elephants, I wanted to ask, like, where did he get the test subjects to display what an electric chair, what was it doing, or like who did they test it on? How could you get someone to test it? I'm like, would like a poor person observe, to volunteer for that or something? And you said an elephant and also a dog. Okay, that makes sense. Electricity, death ray. Okay, can't think of anything else. I thought I was going to say something else, but I can't remember. Well, I think I know. Now. Does anyone know the origin of like heads and tails, like how that came on coins? I thought that I think there's some kind of I think the original kind of way they would determine heads and coins was you would have the head representing the monarch you would get it from, and I think the other side you'd have the value of the coin on the other side. And I was just going to say that I think it's in Serbia. In Serbia, they have a picture of Tesla on the money, but in America, we're too traditional to actually do that, and we should really have Tesla on our money because he's probably the greatest naturalized American citizen ever.
Yeah, he actually came up with a remote control idea, wireless remote control for he had a little toy boat that he directed around via wireless radio waves and that.
Awesome.
Yeah, he was so far against. He was sitting in the park one day and he looked up at the sun and he had this vision and he saw the entire working three-phase AC motor looking at the sun. It just struck him like a lightning bolt.
I'm gonna add to my list of scientific discoveries that came from really weird sources. I think it's also the guy who discovered the DNA helix, the guy who discovered the DNA helix, he did that while he was on LSD. And also I think it was the Higgs boson. I think it's no, not the Higgs boson. There's some idea in physics, and the guy who he said he got the idea for this idea in physics from he had a dream where a snake was eating a boot or climbing a rope or something. And that's sort of where, but yeah, you have we have certain ideas, inspirations for scientific ideas come from really weird places of inspiration. I think it's actually something that I've heard Noam Chomsky talk about in a documentary made about, or there's a documentary out there called "Is the Man Who Was Tall Happy?" And at one point he says that we can't really scientifically document creativity. We're trying to, but it's hard because it's just random. It's something. It's almost because it's so random. It's almost something you can't really document scientifically. That's kind of like sort of out of the area of science per se. We want to study it, but we can't study it because it's just so weird and random and strange. It's like something we can't get under empirical means. It's hard to get under empirical means. Okay, there we go.
Oh, not again. I can hear the cat doing the hookah hookah thing, so I'll be back in a minute.
I'm not sure who asked the history behind heads and tails on coins.
It was me. I always said that.
Well, probably one of the best ways to trace that is to look at Roman coins, because of the extent of the Roman Empire and how that pertains to the formation of modern Europe. Traditionally, republic coins, they would have the face of whatever emperor was in power in a specific area. It could vary from time period to time period, but the tails of the coin, the backside of the coin, was usually for more artistic license. Whereas the front was, a particular leader, a lot of times the backside of the coin would be local to the area, very much in the same sense of like how they did the minting of the quarters, the state quarters, where they would put material based on the specific state or things that were important to that state. They would do that with a specific province. So
Let me state that, for example, that where I originally heard this from was like it was a definite source. It was like if you've read David Graeber's book, The First 5,000 Years, he just has a very brief passage where he says, "Where do we get coins? How do coins work?" And then he says, "Here's how," and then he says, "Heads, tails." He's like, "This is how all coins work," which is what I believed at the time. And then he explained how something related to money and how the origin of money historically, how it works. And it was, it was kind of a very interesting chapter, and
I'm sure
some weird stuff.
But I mean, it makes sense if you look at it from a generalized anatomical perspective. What's the opposite of your head? Your rear, your tail. So.
Yeah.
And speaking of coins, if you ever have a chance to go to a local Renaissance fair, a lot of them they'll have a guy on site who actually strikes coins in the way they did for most of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. And it's a large machine, large chamber, and it comes down like a hammer and smashes the soft metal into a specific print based on what thing he puts into the chamber. It's pretty cool. It's loud too.
I mean, what is it? Does it just mint coins from that era, or does can you have certain things made for you?
He does stuff, historical designs, but a lot of them are fantasy and all kinds of things, shapes, designs.
I see.
The basic principle is still there. You just need to have the mold. It's an inverse mold. And the great thing about it is you basically make both sides of it at the same time.
Most of the alchemy documents that came out that were found recovered from or bought or taken from Islam, from the Muslims, were about making coins. How to extract gold or silver from base metals. The idea that, which I think is actually proven now, that you can actually, I don't know the process, but you can extract gold from using sea salt and I think it's bicarbonate soda.
A lot of people neglect that alchemy was more philosophical than it was literal. I mean, you can take it from a literal perspective that they were actually trying to make gold out of lead. But a lot of people who followed the alchemy. They followed it more in the sense of a philosophical discipline, in much the same way that people played chess to help them
Well,
to be better rulers.
Oh wait. Whoa. Okay. What? Okay. How did the Well, what would philosophy? Okay. How would alchemy help you spiritually or philosophically? How would doing that help? Like, what was the goal? And if it's not to make gold out of gold or to produce a philosopher's stone, then what was the use?
Well, I think the idea is you can get the pure whatever they call the philosopher's stone. You can get from base metals, and I think that by finding that in nature, you can also there's also a way of transforming yourself. By following that process, you can also look at it allegorically as a way of finding the purity within yourself, the philosopher's stone beneath all the false personalities.
Okay, let me kind of try to explain what. I'll just bring up this one thing. There's a book a friend of mine recommended about Jung, and it's the Portable Jung, and there's just like a 100-page chapter on alchemy symbols. Like, what is the point of that? Is that going to give me any benefit whatsoever when studying Jung?
Well, I think the theory was at the time you can actually make gold, and if you have the power to produce gold, then that's a big benefit because you don't have to have tax on it, and you can produce your own gold.
I like world building, and I like making fictional countries. Which is the one thing about that is it's like I just want to look. Okay, I just want to study a little bit of like alchemical symbols, so I can use those symbols for my like fictional countries. I want to do that. Can someone clarify me? Okay, when was Isaac Newton alive? Can someone tell me around here? When was he alive? Because I'm just saying, like, when did alchemy go out of fashion?
Good question. Yeah. Well, it was during the Enlightenment period, I think.
Isaac Newton was born on January 4th, 1643, in Woolstorpsby, Colsterworth, United Kingdom. He died in March 31st, 1727, in Kensington, London, United Kingdom.
So 1600s. Fine. I'm just saying that because he was like, I think he was said to be, someone said he wasn't the first scientist, but he was the last alchemist. He sort of, tried to work with those principles in mind.
He was the last notable alchemist.
Okay. Oh. All right.
As in a person who publicly ascribed to alchemy. But alchemical principles existed within various different secret orders, esoteric traditions for a very long time. And the thing is to understand about alchemy is it's an extension of a larger group of movements that existed in the Renaissance, which itself was an extension of classicism. People were really much, they were studying a lot of classic Greek philosophy and in ancient aesthetics and religion. And Renaissance occultism was really a forebearer of an evolution of earlier forms of Hermeticism. A lot of the concepts, the cosmological concepts, are of an esoteric character. There's an emanationist character to it, very much like Platonism, and a lot of Renaissance occultism, alchemy, Hermetic principles, these ideas all sort of coalesced in the Renaissance. And a lot of you were speaking earlier about the various metals, the various processes in alchemy, like incineration, cogitation. There's a few others. I was looking up something here. Coagulation, fixation, dissolution, digestion. There's I think 10, 15, something like that. These all were correspondent to each other. They were a part of a larger. Largely, a lot of these concepts were correlated to Hermetic Kabbalah. How Jewish Kabbalah was incorporated into Renaissance occultism. They largely were astrological in character, planetary in character, and they had to do with very meditative philosophical concepts. They were all related.
One of the ideas with Gnostic alchemy is the idea that the essence is trapped within the ego, and which is similar to how you can extract the pure. The idea is that gold is not something you make from other things; it's something you release from material. So, same process as releasing the pure essence from that's trapped within the ego.
It sounds like that sounds like some kind of like what the Cathars would do. Like Cathars, that's like sounds like the Cathars went underground.
Yeah.
Cathar heretics. I mean.
The Cathars were related to that in some manner of speaking. Yes.
They were dualists. They were philosophical dualists.
The thing is, though, the Cathars were a direct opposition to the church, whereas a lot of members of esoteric traditions were members of churches publicly and were part of mystery traditions in private.
Actually, like, do you know a lot about Freemasonry? Because that's a topic that I've been meaning to study.
It's an interesting subject. I'm by no means an expert at it at all.
I feel like there's this quote from this one Freemason I saw on a documentary. It was like it was a History Channel documentary, so it was pretty crappy. And someone said, "People think we're trying to take over the world. We can't even decide. We're trying to run the world, but we can't even decide like what type of sandwiches to serve at our meetings."
That's a sentiment reiterated by a lot of my friends who are Masons. But they're all related. Freemasonry, Martinism, Gnosticism, Rosicrucianism, Kabbalism, yeah, they're all related to Renaissance occultism and the Western esoteric tradition.
All right, yeah, I see. Okay, I ask you a question. How often have you read about alchemy or Jung? Are you into Jung at all? Have you read any books by alchemy?
Yeah. Well, the first alchemy document that was introduced to Europe was the Turba Philosophorum, which is a crowd of philosophers. That was the first translation from Arabic, because at the time they were way ahead in Mecca. And that was like what Kevin was just saying. It was set out in a kind of Socratic way of a bunch of philosophers sitting around and talking about like Democritus sitting around and talking about about nature and how to extract metals, and then it went into how to make coins. And they give you these explanations of how it's done, but it's all very.
Was there ever this story? I mean, just sort of like this idea. Was there ever this person in the Middle Ages who was basically like to say he was an alchemist and then he got rich and then he said, "Well, I got rich because now I learned how to make gold out of lead." Was there ever sort of like a guy who said that, or some guy who claimed to do that and then he got rich?
I've heard, yeah, I think I've heard that.
This is all just like something I could include in my my fictional nation I can imagine. So I feel like I would include some kind of historical story about that. Okay, there's actually like on this one famous website, there's like historians talking about alchemy. They had a panel, and someone asked, "Why did people in the Middle Ages think you could make lead out of gold?" And someone said, "Well, there was one person who said that because there are some people like such and such who said they could make lead out of gold out of lead." So they said, "Well, that's probably one reason why." The other reason why, and I thought, okay, well. Yeah, that makes me curious. Like, was there ever an alchemist who just basically seems to have gotten rich and made it go nowhere? Not this. That wouldn't necessarily prove it, but it's just that'd be. I wonder if that's ever. That seemed like something that would happen. It'd be interesting to hear about that.
There was a story, Paracelsus. There was a story of Paracelsus where he found a spider trapped in a tree. No, it was Satan was trapped in a tree, and he said he would let him out if he told him the secrets of alchemy. And then he let him out, and then he went to, and then he said, "I bet you can't do that again." And then he turned into a spider, and then he trapped him in the tree again. So he extracted all the secrets from Satan, and then trapped him back in the tree.
Wait, did Paracelsus claim this happened to him?
It's just a story. I don't think it's. I think it's an allegory. Really.
Oh, well, all right, I guess so. I guess,
But
okay,
then,
well, Paracelsus claimed to happen to him, or did it just happen to someone else?
no, yeah, I think he said it happened to him. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Hmm. I think it's about the church suppressing these things because obviously if people can start making their own, if people don't need the church and they start making their own fortunes, then really that you're dealing with the devil because you're going against the church's authority. So you have to deal with the devil in order to become an alchemist in a way.
Maybe.
Even though there was a lot of popes that were really into alchemy.
I guess I can kind of bring this up related to that, as I feel like when we talk about, I don't know, I guess talking about church authority makes me want to bring this up, the fact that, on one hand, I want to note that there were certain kind of pre-Protestant religious movements that just, I mean, yeah, you get really uneducated people together who can be charismatic, who can think differently from their religious authorities necessarily. You do end up getting some kind of weird religious sects. And of course, one of those would be people like the Cathars. Another one would be, if you can look them up, they're actually more modern than Cathars would be the Waldensians. And they sort of seem to be pre-Protestants. The Protestants we know of today, the only reason they're famous is because now they've continued in the modern day, because they got actually really, really popular in their era. So they had things like a 30-year war, the Protestants still exist. So, or just got really popular. But there are sort of movements that resemble Protestantism a lot that existed prior to it, that exist, prior to that era. That's interesting to me. And I guess also maybe you can include early on in Christianity, certain Gnostic movements. I can't remember one thought that there was like a female incarnation of Christ. I don't really believe in them at all. I'm just saying that it's interesting that they popped up. But when you talk about alchemy, and when popes got into it, I want to state this, which is that basically when witch burning started in Europe, many people, and I guess this is just something that, and historians say this as well, it's just, people have the wrong idea about witches in the Middle Ages. On one hand, because witch burnings didn't start until like the early modern period. Mostly, the Middle Ages, witch burnings were not that common. But then witches became to be persecuted, first of all. Second of all, in the Middle Ages, belief in magic was not uncommon. And they had a word for, this is something that, people think is a fiction thing, but it's actually something that goes back a long time, is you have white witches, and then you have black witches, or bad witches. And a white witch was a witch who was a good witch, who would perform good spells. So, and they also called those people cunning folk. You can look them up. And a cunning folk would, they get and they have their different ideas from different things. They have the preternatural. Some say they get the power from the preternatural, which would be fairies. Sometimes pre-Christian, pagan, they would. I read a book about gypsy magic. They had some kind of folk Christianity. That's the term. They would get their claim to get their magic from the familiars, from pagan deities, or they wouldn't say pagan deities, but they would appeal to Jupiter in their prayers, and they would and then they would get, sometimes they would just get blessings from Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints, things like that. Different things that cunning folk would use. So magic was not seen as evil. It was bad magic that was seen as evil. And of course, if you thought magic was real, of course you're going to think that, yeah, we have to burn people, and we need to keep people. And also, when you had witch burnings early on, it was sort of seen as a very superstitious thing to believe. Seriously. It was seen as this very weird, insane thing to actually think. There are actually citations of many early Christians denouncing the idea that pagan magic has any kind of ability whatsoever. And there's, I think, actually there's one sort of statute made in Finland that kind of excommunicated anyone who thought that the Temple of Demeter had any kind of power or something like that. They thought that it was more like they believed pagan myths were superstition, as opposed to believing they had some kind of dark power over the world. I always like that idea. But I'm saying, yeah, early on, when the belief in witches became common in the late Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, it was not there. And what people tried to suppress belief in witches when it first came about, because they thought that, like, I mean, it was sort of similar to believing in UFOs. Imagine if you're just like a regular Christian in the 6th century, and then you hear some people saying, well, there's people who, like, have orgies with the devil in the woods, and they make pacts with him, and, like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You know? That's not a normal thing to believe. But then later on, you know, it got into people in positions of power came to believe in it, like the popes. Originally, it started out as just this very kind of superstitious thing. All right, that's all I wanted to say. Yeah, most cunning folk were Christian. But it's just that the sources I've read said they would use pagans, or they would use fairies or familiars or whatever.
That's part and parcel for folk Christianities in different parts in history and different cultures. A lot of times there were loose syncretisms that went on. You see different kinds of manifestations of it within Afro-Caribbean religions like Voodoo and Santeria, and to a lesser extent Palo Mayombe. They integrate elements of Christianity, but the ways in which that developed was largely to conceal its pagan character underneath, so they could practice openly. But in a lot of the Middle Ages, since conversion was a lot more abrupt, there were people who were sort of lost in between and still held on to certain ideas whilst also being Christian. So it was more of almost like a hackneyed version of more rural, less educated form of Christianity.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Well, yeah, the Gnostics and the Templars were worshipping Baphomet, who you can trace to, which the goat, the devil, which you can trace back to Pan, who was the god of nature. So it's people.
The early church, they depict the devil the early church depicted the devil in a very different way. I just want to say that, yeah, connecting him to Pan, that happens a lot in European cultures, but like early on in Christian history, it was not that way. I think the devil was actually associated with Hades. And you do get a lot of, to make another point that many like Eastern Christians make, is that there's no word for hell in the Testament. There are 3 words used for hell: Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus. And almost always, like when you read hell in the 4 Gospels, Jesus is referring to Hades. It's like the gate. It's not the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. It's the gates of Hades. And also the fires of Gehenna, the fires of hell. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that.
I'd like to express an objection to just that kind of line of thinking here for a moment. The figure of the devil being connected to Pan, it's not because devil worship extends to pagan religion, but rather that the church constructed the image of the devil.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
I think that's a minor correction, but I think it's an important one.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
The only thing I want to say about I'm saying is it wasn't always that way. No. When they branched out to the Germanic parts, then they started to associate Pan with the devil. Early on,
the figure of the devil, of Satan, of Lucifer, was much more in character to the original Jewish figure of an adversary, and was a fallen angel. It was less demonic in the Roman sort of modern way we think about it.
Oh yeah. Was Pan in the Greek myths, or was it a Germanic? Actually, now I think about it, Pan was also in the Greek myths.
Yes.
And it's always this sort of Pan is this kind of deity associated with I want to say I don't mean to be too explicit. I don't hope I'm being too crude, but like orgies, like panic, loud noises.
Yeah.
Like,
well, he was a member of a group of deities within Greek religion that were the rustic gods. They were associated with nature and fertility.
Yeah.
Pan was the child of Hermes and a nymph, which is basically a nature spirit. Mm-hmm. He was called Pan because, despite his rather bestial features, he was loved among the gods.
Oh.
But we get the term panic from Pan because of the other features of Pan, other than his general rustic, sexual, and fertility aspect. He was also associated with fear and panic and chaos. Very much the sort of association of people wandering through the forest and being lost and fearful.
Was he associated with the Bacchic cults? Was he associated with the Bacchic cults?
Yes, all the rustic gods are associated with Dionysos on some level, including the Chthonic Hermes.
I have a book. I'm actually on Audible. It was an audiobook of this called Dancing in the Spirit, which is more or less a secular academic work about the history of dance and dances. And I'm sorry, it's very interesting to me. It talks about the Bacchic cult and how they were associated with many types of dances and parties and how that they got really looked down upon.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, if Pan's a representation of nature, and obviously nature, there are earthquakes and all sorts of disasters that is why people tend to fear, why it induces a sense of panic. Yeah.
Interesting thing about Pan is he's actually a peculiarity in Greek religion, largely because the Greeks they were definitely fixated on aesthetics, and particularly the human aesthetic. The vast majority of the gods and goddesses in Greek religion were depicted as fully anthropomorphic, and usually anything with a therianthropic, animalistic character was relegated to the Egyptians. The Greeks very much thought that. They tried to reduce, at least in classical times, to reduce the animal associations of their gods, because they felt that the human form was of perfection. That very much where we get a lot of our modern concepts of aesthetics in Europe. But Pan was a notable exception. They think that's largely because Pan comes from a much earlier time in pre-classical Greek history, where there was less of that emphasis, and that is echoed by Etruscan pre-Roman history as well. The Romans, their religion prior to the sort of Hellenized Etruscanization of their religion, taking upon Greek character into Roman religion, that they had a much more abstract and animistic concept of religion, to the effect that it was even been theorized they didn't even have forms for the gods. They didn't have statuary in the way that we would think of, which is also echoed in early Celtic religion. There's actually interactions with Celtic chieftains. There's a story about this where they are introduced to Rome by one of the Roman legionaries, and they laugh at the Romans because they think it's so odd that they had statues. So, like, our concepts of these very human figures, these very perfect human figures, is a very Greek concept when you think of it that way.
Mm.
And by extension of that, an interesting piece of history, if you're ever interested in looking into it, is the Greco-Buddhist period. It's basically the interaction between India and Greece. And that's where a lot of the very Greek-styled Indian statues come from, is from that period. Both Buddhist and Hindu.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to say that, do you know much about, you mentioned you're a pagan. I guess one thing I want to ask is, I think that Julius Caesar says that the main trait, the main god of the Germanics is Hermes. Do you know about that? Do you know how that got to be? He says that. He says the main god of the Germanics is the Hermes. They mainly worship him. That
is a highly contested statement in study of Celtic religion. Okay. It's part of a larger, it's part of something called Interpretatio Romana. It's basically the Romans saying what Celtic religion is. It's where we know a lot of Roman period Celtic religion from. Much later, obviously, we get from the Ulster cycles and things like that for Irish mythology. But for the Gauls, for Celtica, for Roman period Celts, we largely have to take the Romans at their word a lot of times. There was many different gods in Celtic religion associated with various different tribes, and that Hermes that they talk of could be 20 different gods.
Oh,
easily.
All right. I thought you were like I thought you knew the original sources or whatever about Celtic religion. Oh well, this is why, because Hermes, maybe this god resembles Hermes or something like that. He attributes one other thing. Okay, I was going to mention this earlier. Now I remembered. When you said like they would associate the gods, they wanted to have them be perfect human forms. But one of the things that relates to that is that the Romans, I think it was Heraclitus, like Heraclitus. He said that Herodotus. he said that this kind of like Greek-centric, Greco-centric theory. He said the Titans flew away in Greece and they went to Egypt and they transformed themselves into animals, and that's how they became the Egyptian gods. They accepted these pantheons of other deities, but they sort of slurred them, seeming sort of inferior to them.
You're getting into a very sordid and very interesting area. Two actually interesting areas that are related. This right here is syncretism, which is very fascinating within a polytheistic perspective, because the ways in which it develops is over time and through the interaction of multiple cultures. Two of the main ones that you touched on are some of the most prominent ones we know of. Gallo-Roman, which is the early Celtic religion and Roman religion, and Greco-Egyptian syncretism, which was a much larger and much more extensive syncretism that happened during the Hellenistic period, particularly during Ptolemaic times. If you know who Ptolemy is, largely a lot of those Hellenistic reforms were developed under his rule.
Wait, he was a pharaoh.
Mm-hmm.
He created the geocentric model of the universe. No, just before him. But... Is that the one?
Okay, one of the more primary examples of a Ptolemaic reform and why it was done has to do with the cult of Serapis and Isis. Serapis is actually a pre-Greek deity. There was a syncretism that existed in ancient Egypt. It was a syncretism of Osiris and Apis. Osiris being the god of death and Apis being the bull god. And he was Hellenized to create Serapis. The figure of Serapis had a basket on his head, a very floral-looking, very Greek-looking type basket on his head, but a very Greek, very Zeus-looking face. And over time, as Serapis developed, he took on attributes of various different deities. He took on attributes of Isis, but most especially Hades, even being depicted with the three-headed dog and a staff. And Isis, that association connected the Hellenized Egyptian deity with a specifically Egyptian deity who was very popular during Greek times and continued to be very popular throughout Roman times. And the cult of Serapis being in the Hellenistic period, the sort of period that frames between the classical Greek and the Republican Roman period, that is, or the Roman Republic, it continued to be more popular and exceedingly popular right around the time of the formation of Christianity. So it was often in direct opposition to it.
Okay, I just want to ask the question again. Was Ptolemy the general of Alexander the Great who took over Egypt, who got to be pharaoh after Alexander conquered it? I know one of Alexander the Great's generals took over Egypt. Or he took over Egypt and he got to be pharaoh, and that's actually where Cleopatra. She's a descendant. Cleopatra was a descendant of him. I was asking about that.
There's the Roman Ptolemy, which is Claudius Ptolemaeus, he was born in 100 AD. But the Ptolemy I'm referring to is from the Ptolemaic kingdom, the first Ptolemy, Ptolemaeus Soter, the savior.
Okay.
He was the founder of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Yes, I believe so. Yeah. He was at the time of Alexander, and it had a lot to do with Alexander's reign and how he's extending into Kemet. So.
One other thing I wanted to ask about, just about the city of pagan. You mentioned that before. I just wanted to ask about this. Was there a certain deity who got forged after Christianization? Was there ever a god that developed afterwards, specifically?
Depends on when you want to consider the time of Christianity.
Maybe after it got banned in the kingdom, or maybe like after Christians became long after Christians. Or I want to say long after these funny became a minority or whatever. Or I don't know. I guess maybe that's unfair to ask. I had sort of like the dates in front of me. It'd be maybe easier. Saying deities, maybe they existed after, long after Christianization. They seem to have come about, and we can't find records of before Christianization.
If you're speaking specifically of the West, and I'm referring to the West, including basically anything in the Roman Empire on, there's definitely a lot of arguments to be made that there were deities contemporary to the formation of Christianity, but not when it was standardized. Perfect example of this is Antinous. Antinous was he went through apotheosis. He was a lover of Hadrian, Emperor Hadrian, who died in the Nile and was deified during his reign.
Oh, I see.
Is considered the last Roman pagan deity.
Oh.
Which was around 110 to 130.
What was he the god of?
Antinous is very unique. The thing is about Antinous, he was associated with various different deities. He was syncretized with Hermes, Dionysos, Apollon, with various Egyptian deities, particularly Osiris. So his role was very specific to the cult of Antinous. And Antinous worshippers very much sort of had their own mystery cult, very much in the way that you would think of the
Even Constantine had a secret shrine to Mithras.
Yes. And that was a very common theme in the Hellenistic period leading into...
I thought about mentioning that earlier. Sorry, I hate to interrupt you. I was thinking about that earlier because someone brought up Constantine. I was going to say that historians are sort of like they're saying they're sort of conflicted about him because they're not sure what he was. You know, some the church wants to paint him as a Christian, Catholic historians want to paint him as a Christian, but he seems to have done things that he indicated at various times that indicate that he was a pagan. And I think some people want to say that he seems to want it both ways. He seems to want to be a pagan and a Christian at the same time, or to worship Christ as a pagan deity.
There's a lot of related events throughout, the span of early Christianization that supports that view. The perfect example of that would be the Arian heresy. A lot of early Arian Christianity, they didn't consider Jesus to be the Son of God. They considered him almost as a demigod.
Well, it's kind of one way of painting it. There are different forms of Arianism. I just want to point out there are different forms of Arianism. Some thought that he was born sort of a demigod, then he got ascended. Well, the point is that he ascended. It was that he was a human being, or he was part God. Then he became a demigod. Then he ascended to heaven and became a demigod. Yeah, that's basically one common idea. And then that was kind of the thing that pissed everyone off. So that pissed the church fathers off so much because it seems like they're basically bringing in pagan ideas, trying to undermine the deity of Christ, ignoring his roles, the logos, which is very common in Christianity, so on and so forth. Pissed them off a whole lot. And by the way, it is notable that Constantine, prior to the Council of Nicaea, and he basically, a lot of people who are pro-Constantine point out the fact that prior to the Council of Nicaea, he said he was sympathetic to Arianism, and then he basically had to shut up after the church said that it's actually heretical.
Sure. I don't think of it necessarily as some sort of... I'm trying to think of the term I'm looking for. I don't think of it as debunking Constantine by any stretch, but I pointed out merely to demonstrate that early Christianity had a lot of ambiguity, and people who were Christianized could have done it for a variety of reasons, from a variety of different perspectives.
It is kind of like something that makes me, as a Christian, a little bit kind of queasy. Simply the fact that just kind of thinking about the Trinity and sort of it got expressed in completely rationalistic philosophical terms because of the Greek Hellenistic influence at the time. But of course, it came out of the Hellenized Judaism. It became Christianity is a product of Hellenized Judaism, and there could have been other sort of I want to say not non-Trinitarian views, but I want to say there would have been very more symbolic, mystical, literary expressions of the Trinity that existed had we not had the Council of Nicaea that decided to phrase it in sort of philosophical terminology. It wouldn't have
Gnostic.
been.
Gnostic.
What?
At the very least, Gnostic. Little G of Gnostic. Not necessarily full-on Gnosticism, but they were ideas with Gnostic character.
You're saying that the Trinity, like the definition of Trinity, had ideas of Gnostic character?
No, quite the opposite. Ideas that were non-Trinitarian were Gnostic by character.
I guess so. Yeah, exactly. That was something that.
A lot of them had a very different view of Jesus. That's what.
Wait, do you mean? Okay, from what I understand, like the sort of church historians, the earliest Christian heresies, I think the earliest Christian heresies were about him not being a man, and then it became like I think that the Gnostics were known. The Gnostics were known for him saying that no, Jesus isn't a man; he was a divine theophany. Jesus was sort of a divine ghost, like just kind of like. What? I'm sorry. I'm saying. Okay, I'm just trying to say. Okay, let me try this. I'm sorry. I just heard that Gnostics they wanted to make Jesus not man. They wanted to make him completely God, completely divine. They couldn't accept the idea that Jesus was a man in a sense because they hated the material realm. That was what I understood. That was what I read.
I think I wasn't really making myself quite clear, and that's my fault. The ways in which non-Trinitarian views have more of a Gnostic character has less to do with essence and substance of Jesus and more to do with his role towards the Godhead. The view of Jesus being God, co-substantiation with God, was a view that was opposed by Gnostic theology. Oftentimes they viewed him as an aeon or as a sort of demigod or not of God. Something separate from God. A separate being with separate intelligence. That kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
Can you say that again?
You want me to reiterate?
I just missed the last bit of what you said about the Godhead.
Jesus being a separate substance from God, not being God himself, or at least in some way having more of a separation from God. In a lot of Gnostic theologies, one of the common themes, which relates it very much to Platonic thought and to Hermetic thought, is that there's an emanationist cosmology, that there's a Godhead and various different emanations or sort of lesser deities within that sort of cosmology. You really see this in Valentinian Gnosticism. There are various different sigils or pairs of specific aeons that are related to very abstract concepts, much in the way that Kabbalah and the Sephira are aspects of creation. And Christos was considered one of those aeons in many Gnostic cosmologies, oftentimes as a bridegroom pair with Sophia.
Anthropos.
Being man and church, ecclesia and anthropos.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very, very common theme. That's what I meant to say.
I think I was going to bring in something out another different philosophical school, or kind of. Oh yeah, the thing I was going to say is like when you said, I thought you were trying to say some of these sort of Gnostic definitions by the Council of Nicaea or whatever. That wasn't okay. I was going to say, well, Christianity is influenced by Neoplatonism, and the most explicit way of that would be true is simply the fact that the word logos is used to describe Christ, and then the only kind of the thing that would sort of upset Christians is the idea that the logos is sort of seen as a lesser divinity, or like a not fully God, really, some kind of emanation, or some kind of just an aspect of God that is not really God, but just a right, or just I don't know, a lesser part of God or something. That would be the only thing that would upset Christians about. And they decided no, one kind of full person in essence. And also another thing, Heraclitus was the first one to believe that the Heraclitus existed in Neoplatonism, but I know the worst one to sort of use the term logos in Greek, said that there's sort of this reasoning principle behind all reality, giving it its being, and the creation that causes its creation is Heraclitus. Okay. It goes back to pre-Socratic philosophy. That's okay, yeah, that's something I remembered. But I also wanted this, I guess maybe one thing that I thought was interesting, this poem written by one of the early church fathers, I think I actually said it from memory, very God yet spirit, very God yet, oh no, let me get it, I'm sorry.
Well, Augustine started out as a Gnostic. He was a Manichaean. And then he ended up writing against them, the Gnostics. He was writing against dualism, and he was basing his argument on the Trinity on the first passage in John, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So he's saying that they're all one. It's all one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in all fairness, even Gnostic forms of Christianity do, on some level, agree with that oneness, but they come to it from a very different, much more pluralistic perspective, one that the early church fathers would have considered pagan, and could arguably be as such. If you look at things like Valentinian Gnosticism at face value, it seems very pagan, a pantheon of aeons, in a sense.
Okay, can I kind of bring in, personally, I have three things to say about that. I once went on this, the Gnostics on Facebook, and I just decided to mess with them. And so I wrote, like, this kind of message, just to post, like, trying to tell them, repent now, so you may not burn, do not worry, about fear the fire that is eternal, or something like that. Like, I was basically some kind of hellfire freak to kind of warn them. I did it as a joke, just to mess with them, and they kind of, one person commented, well, you should probably go learn about this guy called Valentinus. Valentinus invented the Trinity. They tried to say Valentinus invented the Trinity, and there is just a book written, there is a treatise written by him just called On the Three Natures. That was interesting. And when he said Gnostic...
Sorry.
What?
On the three, that was isn't that a lost text from Valentinus?
We don't. Yeah, it's a law. I'm pretty sure we don't have a copy, but he did write it.
Mm.
That was one of the things that the Arians accused the Christian. The Arians accused them of being accused the Trinitarians of being Gnostics, because we have one Gnostic text written by Valentinus, which kind of seems to point to deal with the threefold deity. Okay, there's that. One other thing, when you said that they were kind of pagan ideas, there is a story that is included by Tertullian. You know him?
Yeah.
There's a story told by Tertullian. We're not sure if it's true, but the idea is that after Christ was crucified, Tiberius took the time, and he basically tried to put forward legislation saying that it was legal to worship Jesus as a deity. He wanted to make it legal to worship Jesus as some kind of pagan deity, because he heard about this crucified white Jewish wise man. And according to him, he says, yeah, he wanted to make it legal, but then it kind of got rejected or something. Now, the third thing I want to say is, when I said kind of literary expressions of Trinity that aren't necessarily philosophical, this isn't for the Trinity, this is for the deity of Jesus. It says, very flesh and spirit too, only created and yet born. God and man in one indeed. God and man in one agreed, very life and death indeed. For God and Mary's seed at once impossible and torn. By pain and suffering here below, Jesus Christ and as our Lord we know. Okay, that was something written by a church father. This is Saint Ignatius. Things I say right here, Saint Ignatius.
I didn't really catch that. Is that
let me post.
Right.
I had studied Gnosticism at one point, and kind of my view of it over the years has changed considerably. One of the things I've largely come to the conclusion of, and I've discussed this with more Orthodox Christians coming from mainline traditions, and people who practice some form of esoteric Christianity, some iteration of some kind of Gnostic version of Christianity. And I think the best compromise that you can come to theologically is that Gnosticism as a grouping of religions, or even just as a single religion, is different than Orthodox Christianity. I would largely say if you were to put it at the face, if you were able to come to some sort of agreed upon definition of what all Christianity is and what all Gnosticism is, they are two totally different religions. They refer to the same figure, but the ways they come to that conclusion, the way they come to their conclusions, is completely different in a lot of ways.
It's definitely influenced what we have today as Christianity. It's just a big eclectic collection of all different. You know, there's even Buddhism in there, I think.
There's a lot of similarity to Buddhism. Some have actually made direct correlations to it and used some sort of historical reference, though it's very loosely defined. I'll admit that there's not a whole lot of support for that. But
yeah, I think the rebirth is definitely, you know, the death and resurrection. That seems very Buddhist, as like the death of the ego and being born again.
Well, a core Gnostic tenet is a cyclical cosmos. A lot of Gnostics, especially a lot of modern Gnostics, believe in reincarnation. The vast majority of the ones that you'll probably run into in any sort of discussion, they probably believe in some form of reincarnation. So there's a very big split, cosmologically and theologically, between Christianity and Gnosticism, fundamentally.
Well, according to, I can't remember who it was, but someone from the Theosophical Society was saying that originally Origen taught reincarnation, but it was Jerome who came and changed the teachings because it was too, whatever, Gnostic.
Here's the poem I was trying to recite earlier.
It's gone.
It's sort of like a literary, you know.
Yeah, I read half.
Yeah, this is something that St. Ignatius wrote trying to express the divinity of Jesus.
So what's that from?
A letter of St. Ignatius.
All right. But yeah, was that the letter that he wrote on the way to be eaten by lions?
I don't know. It's out of a random Google thing that I read a long time ago. That's the thing I wanted to learn more about. Is I know that in early Christianity, creeds were really important, and they used the creeds to express different parts of the faith, and all kinds of different interesting creedal formulas were created to express their ideas. And I can't really find a source explaining all the creeds or looking from creeds. I can't find one.
I think one of the biggest influences was Marcion. Have you read anything about? Have you read anything? David Boone.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, I think there's arguments that the original gospel, there was the Evangelion, which was then later expanded on by the Church Fathers to put it more in line with the Old Testament and to make it more to keep the Torah, because I think the original Evangelion rejected they wanted a new Christianity which rejected Jewish Christianity, and then later the Church Fathers come in and add Matthew and Mark and so on to bridge the gap. But we don't. That's what you were saying about Tertullian. We don't know who first had the first texts. We don't know where they came from. Some people say that Marcion wrote them himself. I don't know if that's what you were asking, but.
John, or sorry, what? Kevin, can you tell me about your personal like beliefs as a pagan? Like, what kind of if you're a pagan, tell me what kind of pagan you are, what your pagan ideas, beliefs, how do you practice your spirituality? You can tell me that stuff.
I'll give you a little background. I came to paganism when I was a teenager, about 15, 16 years old. Spent a lot of time just studying various different things. Kind of didn't have anything in particular. When I got into college, and largely because technology had gotten a lot better in the 2000s, I had a lot more access to information and to groups of more specific kinds of paganism. And I discovered largely a methodology of paganism that has formed groups around it, something called polytheistic reconstructionism. And that is a methodology and an approach to pagan religions that tries to rely as best as possible on what we know historically of specific cultures. So there are largely traditions built around that. The primary tradition that I practice, and I practice for about the last 8 years, is Hellenismos, which is basically Greek polytheism, Hellenic polytheism. I have recently, over the last year, been studying Kemetic polytheism and have been incorporating that as a part of my personal practice. But my primary tradition is
or Egyptian paganism, Kemeticism.
Kemetic polytheism, yes. So that's my secondary tradition, which is consistent in polytheistic worldviews. You can practice multiple traditions.
Yeah, I know. Can I be honest? There's one thing about pagan reconstructionists is simply the fact that many. I mean, it seems like some people try to claim to be Celtic paganists, but it's like all we know, most information we have about the Celts when they're paganism, or it just sort of seems like from Asatru as well, is from Christian or Roman sources. Just we don't have Gallic culture. We have like what pagans wrote about them, or what Romans wrote about the Gauls, and so on and so forth, and we don't really have any first-hand sources concerning these people, and we don't really have so it's kind of weird. You're sort of like trying to worship, we use a religion that we barely know anything about. That's the thing about that. Also, I'm going to point out the fact it's sort of weird how people love the Havamal and love, I can't remember the main Ostrich text, but the Havamal is just part of it. They love that text, but it's sort of written down by a Christian. That's all I want to say.
What was your point in saying that?
I was just saying that it's just when certain the more Germanic reconstructionists are trying to reconstruct a religion we don't know all that much about. That's just or it feels like I just don't. It would just seems to be like a religion that we don't know much. From what I understand, it's we don't seem to know a lot about Nordic religion or Germanic religion as much. But Hellenismos is actually the Hellenistic religions, we know a lot about them. We know a lot. Where the same thing with Egyptian religion, but we don't know a whole lot about Germanic, Celtic, Gallic, ideas. We just don't know about that stuff much. That's all I want to say.
Well,
I mean, would you say that? Would you agree?
No, I would, but there's a few caveats to that. Sort of need clarification here. If you were to compare Gaulish or Gallo-Brythonic polytheism, Roman period Celts at the time, and compare that to Gaelic polytheism, it's a very different situation.
Oh
yes,
yeah.
With Gallic, it's mostly language that we know. We have terms, inscriptions, and largely concepts of mythology. Like a lot of people relied on the trifunctional hypothesis by de Musy to reconstruct Roman period Celtic polytheism. Other models have arisen out of that, but we know the least about that form of Celtic polytheism, unfortunately. Now, with Gaelic, we have the cycles. They're highly Christianized. With Welsh, we also have much later that's far less reliable and much shorter. But we also have something called the Comuna Gaelica, which is a collection of poems, chants, incantations, prayers, recipes even, from Scottish sources that are used to construct a more Celtic practice. And there's some interesting pros and cons here. Like, for instance, if we were to compare Greek religion to Gaelic polytheism, we know a lot more about the state religion of Greece in Athens than we knew about any sort of group religion in Gaelish areas. But we know a lot more about the folk tradition of the Irish people than we knew necessarily about the folk traditions of the Greeks. Because a lot of that shit was not written down. If you weren't important, you weren't written down.
Yeah, interesting.
And since it had a later reconstruction, or rather, since it was written down by monks at a time where we had much better access to written word, they considered it of historical relevance. They wrote it down. And so the same thing exists with Germanic religions, Germanic folklore, with Slavic and Baltic folklore to a lesser extent, and also the Chechen, Ingush, and Circadian, Caucasian mythologies in the Balkans. A lot of these sort of fringe folk religions that managed to survive Christianization.
So you said the Caucasus religions. Do we know that from like main sources, or you're saying that we know that only from Christian sources?
Largely through Christian sources. If you're looking into Caucasian mythology, look into the Nart sagas. They're very similar to Arthurian legend. Some people have said that Arthurian legend was inspired by the Nart sagas.
Man, I really wish I actually kind of want to learn about Arthurian legends in the future. I wouldn't be interested in like the pagan pre-versions of it, but this to kind of like I don't know. I think it's a very good medium that I could pick up. I don't know. I just like the aesthetics of it. They interest me.
Sure. But yeah, there's definitely gaps in what we understand on certain things, and some things are largely built off of chance. A lot of the clay tablets that we have, a lot of the writings we have of the ancient Near East, we found by chance, like in the early 1900s. You know, we found clay tablets in the sand. That's why we have a lot of ancient Sumerian mythology.
Yeah.
And we're finding more all the time. We actually now have a continuation, a very recent reconstruction of the latter part of. I always space out on his name. He's a titular Sumerian hero. Gilgamesh. There we go.
Gilgamesh.
Yeah, there's a continuation. There's actually an updated version of Gilgamesh. They were able to fill in some gaps.
Oh, interesting. Very nice.
And I do know people who do that as well. Ancient Near East recon. There's different varieties of it. There's actually pre-Islamic Arabian mythology. Talk about, out there. So there's stuff out there.
Yes. Well, can I ask you, I'm not sure if you know about Jungian psychology, but I just know maybe you might be able to help me if you're a pagan. I am trying to do some world building historically right now. Can you tell me some certain symbols that I could use? And the two symbols I want to use one symbol for sort of like a puer aeternatus, childishness, also a symbol for creativity, more kind of just, intuitive, listening to the heart, maybe Russillian type thinking, some kind of more emotional side, and also for eccentricity. and then also a symbol for the intellect. Do you have any kind of like? Do you have any like symbol things I could look for? Symbols that I could use, something like that.
Trickster.
It's one idea.
You asked a lot of things all at once, so
I'm sorry. Symbols for, I want to say almost childishness, children, symbols of childhood, and then also symbols of creativity, and then yeah, that intuition, creativity, symbols for that.
Let's just see. The thing is, I kind of wanted to answer your first question because it explains the second answer.
Okay, explain it.
I fucking don't like Carl Jung. To me, he's like Drakkar Cologne, overpowering and overused.
Okay,
I think everybody goes to Carl Jung, but they don't go any further.
Oh.
That's my problem with him. Jung is fine. Same with Joseph Campbell and his contemporaries. But that's not all of mythology. It's not all of mythological study.
Oh, yeah.
I prefer to go to classics. People who actually tried to take a more unblemished, unbiased approach to specific cultures.
Yes.
One of my favorite books is Greek Religion by Walter Booker. He passed away recently.
Yeah, okay, I see. By the way, one thing I was, when I was like, before I became a Christian, I was into Joseph Campbell. And one thing I wanted to say about Joseph Campbell, he kind of seemed to be ultimately a materialist who thought religion had spiritual value and should be practiced for that reason. But it kind of felt like deep down he was a materialist. Do you think that's true?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he was doing a very, he was making religion derivative in the way that a lot of anthropology has done of late, within the last 50 years.
Yeah.
They make it almost into a psychological reflex.
That's not, how is this idea of a psychological reflex? What do you mean by that?
That is to say, it's like he makes religious concepts into like automatic responses as like a function, almost like a function of biology.
Yeah, like religion is just a product of like the way the human brain works. It's sort of like a little part of our brain having to do with prayer, and therefore we only the brain.
Like a fight or flight response.
Yeah. Okay.
But doesn't get into the nuances of those cultural meanings behind them, why certain things developed the way they did.
Okay, the second part. You know all right. Yeah. Now, second part. Do you know about symbols? Just sort of symbols for those things.
Honestly, it depends on the culture. If I would take from what I know, anything associated with Hermes would for mischievous. Yeah, Hermes. Anything involving Hermes. It's a good Western symbol. But see, if I looked at Germanic mythology, then I'd have to go with Loki, who's a completely different character.
Oh. Okay.
Actually, a negative character.
Talking just about tricksters or for creativity?
But then there's also, there's the American Southwest and the concept of the trickster, largely through the coyote, which is also a completely different character.
Oh.
Or the raven.
Well, I'm not talking about trick. Okay, what I didn't want to say trickster. What I wanted to say was creativity and intuition. That was what I wanted the symbol for.
Just one symbol?
Yeah. So a couple, or you can name some different symbols you can think of for that.
What's his name? Go on, you go ahead while I think about it. Johannes, Oannes, the fish god for intuition. Who brought the message from the... You're talking about Jung. Carl Jung saw the sea, the ocean, as the unconscious, where things come up from. And he saw the Oannes, the Babylonian fish god, as the bringer of information from the unconscious, from the sea, to with Christian race. So I think fishes definitely have a relation to intuition.
Okay. Write down that name for me. I'm sorry, I couldn't spell it.
It's where my name John comes from, but it's the original OANNES.
Better if you wrote it down. I'd write it through the English in the chat.
I have to figure out how to write.
Wait, Kevin, can I recommend? Sorry, you said Apollo or what? I can't. Wait, do you have any ideas about creativity, intuition, symbols for that? Wait, sorry, you already wrote that down. Okay, I want to say about, is it Apollo or Apollon? Or are they the same? Apollo.
Apollon is Greek. Apollo is Roman.
Okay. Oh, all right. I can't help it.
Slightly different definitions.
I keep thinking about every time someone brings up Apollo nowadays, I can't help but mention this fact, and people talking about the Hippocratic Oath because into that podcast, one of those episodes of that podcast I was on the Hippocratic Oath, and it talked about Asclepius being the son of Apollon, and Asclepius, we're not really sure. He's like, or we have the only other sort of vow, or I think that I want to say we don't know much about Asclepius, but Asclepius is now still used. He still uses his hammer, his staff, is still used as symbols in the medical profession. And I want to say that just there's a movie I really want to recommend, which is Black Dynamite, and they have a scene referencing Greek mythology. And I don't want to spoil the movie for you. Just please go watch Black Dynamite, and then we'll talk. You can message me about that movie. There's a scene where they talk about Asclepius and Greek mythology, but yeah, you can go watch that. It'd be hilarious.
Probably the thing that will work for you best, particularly if I go with the Roman Apollo, because he had much more of this connotation with the Romans than he did with the Greeks. The sun. Any solar symbol is a symbol of illumination.
Oh.
That's
also,
a very, very, very powerful symbol of the creative inspiration.
I was also going to ask, okay, the other thing kind of goes back to this, because I wanted to ask about questions concerning the intellect and philosophy. You know, are there any philosophical symbols you would recommend?
Well, philosophy, philosophia, is a love of wisdom. Sophia was actually a daemon at one point. She was a personification of wisdom. But a lot of the lesser personifications in daemon were associated with the primary gods of Greek religion. And the most obvious goddess of wisdom is Athena. So that's a very common thing in Greek religion, is that the symbols associated with a powerful and important deity connect you to the meanings and trappings of that specific deity, to their mysteries.
All right. Okay. So now you think maybe Apollon and Athena, I can use those as symbols?
They would have been very commonly used. You could take inspiration from it. Since you're doing this for a world-building kind of concept.
Yeah.
Animal symbols work very well. Most commonly used symbols.
Also, I wanted to say this is sort of like for a flag. Symbols on a flag.
Owls as well.
Oh yeah.
Owls can, because owls can see in the dark.
Was there ever a sort of like, I want to say like, there's got to be like, I want to say maybe they worshipped Socrates at one point when he became deified. I wonder in Greek history. But also I wonder like, did he have like a favorite god or something?
Well, he had a daemon.
Which was.
I can explain that to you. Give me a second.
Oh.
It's rather complicated and has to do with Greek religion, a specific concept within Greek religion that it correlates to things within other polytheistic religions, which I'll briefly explain. There's a common concept in most polytheistic animistic religions of a spirit associated with one's home or dwelling. It was a household spirit. There's various different names depending on it. If you want excellent examples, look at Shintoism. A lot of that common, contemporary practice that happens today, they have that sort of concept. Now, in Greek religion, there was this sort of concept called the agathos daemon, good spirit, basically. Anytime daemon is used within Greek religion, it basically means spirit, because anything is a daemon. The gods are daemon. They're just different kinds. There's different classes of spirits. So the interesting thing about the agathos daemon, what makes it specifically Greek, is that it's not just a spirit of the household, but it's also the spirit of the self, what the Romans called the genius. It's where we get that concept in modern vernacular of one's genius as a sort of abstract for one's inspiration and intellect and intelligence. But in Greek religion, the agathos daemon was not just a god of the household, not just a god of the self, but was also a lesser deity, often taking the form of a snake, sometimes a snake with a human head, and was actually partnered with the goddess of fortune. It was also an epithet of Zeus and an epithet of Hermes. It's a very fucking complicated spirit.
No.
So when you hear Socrates referring to his daemon, he can mean a million fucking things.
Oh. All right.
I hope that gives you a better understanding. Interesting side fact. In Germanic polytheism, the household spirit is called the Landwirte, the landwife. It's a spirit that basically took over your home. It dealt with the affairs of your home, kept it safe, and that you would appease those land spirits. Sometimes it was considered singular, other times in plural.
What's the project for?
Just personal, let me just link it right now. There you go, nation states. Use a medium for world building.
Is your website?
No, it's not my website. No. It's very common. But no, it's just this little common nation building website. It's like a little game.
All right.
Not a very good game, but it's just I use the factbook feature for world building.
I think what will help you for world building, if you're trying to include some sort of reference to religious practices within cultures, I think a historical framework to keep in mind is that most provinces would have a specific deity that was most popular there. Like in Greek city-states, there would be a specific deity that was most popular. It was like that in ancient Sumeria. Each kingdom was associated with a specific deity.
Okay, well, it wasn't really for religion, a pre-modern religion. It was mainly about just wanting for symbols for philosophy and a symbol for sort of kind of a lot more, I don't know how to say it, left brain, other symbol. Representing of the heart or something like that. And then it's like the other one is representing the intellect. If you see that flag right there, if you look at the nation, the flag has a cross, and in the middle it has an Orthodox cross. And also, okay, that's the other thing. Basically, the flag has that symbol, has a symbol on it, because the blue is often associated with the intellect, and orange is often associated with sort of eccentricity, like a sort of jester type color. So it does represent the sort of other kind of left side of the right side of the brain thinking. Yeah, that's a good way of explaining it. The right side of the brain, left side of the brain. On the flag, you can see that the orange and blue. That's what the orange and blue were the colors of the Swiss Guard, which they look They look nice.
Cool.
John, if you're looking at, I think I see that you keep reading The Nation, and I'm reading the fact book. Do you have any comments on that?
What?
Are you reading the fact book? Or
Oh
you
yeah,
keep
just having a look through. I don't know.
Okay.
I was looking at the cross. Where did that cross come from? That's.
It's very commonly used in Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And early Christianity had all kinds of different symbols, including the hero. They didn't have one. The cross wasn't the uniform symbol. I was saying that they had all different kinds of symbols. That's one cross they used.
Yeah. It's quite similar to the a bit different, but the Catholic cross.
I don't know what the Catholic cross is.
The one with a P and then a cross symbol.
The more sort of like representing Peter. Yeah. Okay, I've never seen it before. I'm not really sure. Maybe it does. And by the way, if you ask the sort of traditions, like the logic, like why is the cross that way, the top part represents a banner, which is in all four Gospels is a banner above the cross of Christ, which Pontius Pilate puts up there, and it says, "King Jesus, King of the Jews." And the idea is that the bottom part is sort of like a pedestal that a person can stand on when they're crucified, and then it's tilted because the idea is after the earthquake that happened after Jesus died, it was sort of kind of made it tilt, maybe sort of. And it just hangs. That's basically the story behind why the cross is that way.
What's Noia?
Neoya? What's Neoya?
Noia.
Are you asking what is Neoya?
Yeah.
A world built a con nation, fictional nation that I work on for personal interest.
Okay. So what is this? What actually is it?
What was the second thing you said?
Is it like a game?
Well, the game, nation states is a game, but I just use nation states as a medium for world building. I don't actually think nation states like the stats and like the issues, that part. Not all that. It's not all that fun. Just the fact book part I use for world building.
All right.
Yeah, it's basically a game. Nation states is a game. So once you get into it, you sort of realize it's very different from other games.
Oh, fact book. Found it.
Have you read much about Chinese mythology, Kevin?
Not a whole lot, largely because there's a language barrier.
Oh yeah, I can add that.
But there are similarities to the development of Greek philosophy in China and its relationship to indigenous religion.
Have you read the Tao Te Ching?
Yes, I have.
I read the part of it now the other day. I feel like she was more, but I kind of didn't like what I was reading.
There's a thing with Taoism. Its evolution after Lao Tzu. It's very much in the way of how Plato's work evolved. Each new thinker in Taoism changed Taoist thought, and it progressed and became much more complicated over time. Even from Lao Tzu to Chuang-Tzu, it was a big difference between the way they thought of Taoism.
Oh yeah, that's not okay. I just want to bring up one about Taoism. What I was trying to say earlier, like the other aspect besides the intellect is aimed at the images. I guess I wanted it to influence sort of like, yeah, the right brain, the creative, intuitive side. But then also I wanted to add that the puer aeternatus, which is something that Taoism is associated with. I was going to say like sort of like the uncarved block, being yourself, it's kind of childlike behavior. That's what I wanted the other side to represent as well. So John, now which part are you reading? Do you have any comments about it?
Oh, I'm not reading that. I just had a quick look.
All right. Okay.
What was it you in the fact book?
No, I just just kind of wanted to see what you were looking at and what if you were going to read it and comment on anything. I didn't want to draw attention to part of it. I wanted feedback if you were going to read it. But now you don't have to answer.
It's reading something about a brownie.
A brownie?
Yeah.
You mean a list of national facts? Oh, yeah.
What? I don't really know what I'm reading. Wait, do you just want to give me like a brief explanation of it? What it is?
There are four. Well, let me explain. There are four posts in the fact book. One is the map. One is the Neoian state ideology. Actually, should be like, which is sort of that was to explain the structure of the government, which I feel like it wasn't. Someone just said your government. You should clarify what your government is actually like and the logic behind it. And I read that. You have a list of policies and you have facts about Neoia. And I wrote facts about Neoia a long time ago, and it's changed a lot. The list of policies is about different political issues and like the positions and the arguments about surrounding them the fictional government makes. Neoian state ideology, that has the most history in it, so I guess if you want to comment on it, you should look at that. That would be the only part I suggested. Facts about Neoia, just, I don't know, I had some weird random ideas about it.
What do I go on?
What?
What do I go on?
The Neoian state ideology. It's under there.
Principality of Neoia. All right. That sounds a bit like a socialist utopia.
Yeah, not all that different though. It's an autocracy. So